Hello everyone. Tonight, I've prepared a special compilation of trucker tales, all gathered into one soothing episode for you to enjoy. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It really helps support the channel. Now, let's begin. The engine that counts to 10. From Marcus Rivera. I've been driving long haul for 23 years, and I thought I'd heard every sound a diesel engine could make. The healthy purr of a well-maintained Cummins, the labored wheeze of an overworked motor climbing the Rockies, even the death rattle of a blown head gasket on a lonely stretch of Interstate 4. But what I encountered that foggy October night on Highway 101, somewhere between Eureka and Crescent City, was something that still makes me question everything I thought I knew about the machines that carry us through the darkness. I was hauling a load of redwood lumber south from the mills, my '98 Peterbilt 379 loaded down to nearly 80,000 pounds. The fog had rolled in thick from the Pacific, reducing visibility to maybe 50 feet ahead of my headlights. Those Northern California coastal fogs are unlike anything else, dense as cotton and cold enough to seep through every crack and seal in your cab. The yellow dashed lines appeared and disappeared like ghostwriting, and the only sounds were the steady thrum of my engine and the occasional blast of my air horn to warn any fool car drivers who might be creeping along without proper lights. That's when I first noticed it, around midnight, just past a truck stop called Mel's Last Chance. My engine began to make a sound I'd never heard before, a rhythmic pulsing that seemed almost deliberate. At first I thought it might be a fuel injector acting up, that familiar tick-tick-tick that every driver learns to recognize. But this was different. This was purposeful, measured, almost like counting. I downshifted and listened more carefully, my hands gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. The sound came in groups, distinct pulses separated by exactly the same interval of silence. One pulse, then a pause, then two pulses together, another pause, three pulses. The pattern continued, climbing steadily upward, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the fog creeping through my window seals. My engine was counting. I pulled into the next rest area, a small gravel turnout overlooking the invisible Pacific. The fog swirled in my headlight beams like living things, and I could hear the distant crash of waves against rocks somewhere far below. I popped the hood and grabbed my flashlight, playing the beam over the familiar landscape of hoses, belts, and metal. Everything looked normal. The oil was clean, the coolant levels good, no unusual wear on the belts. But when I climbed back into the cab and fired her up, there it was again, the counting. 4 pulses, pause, 5 pulses, pause, 6 pulses. I tried the radio, desperate for some human contact, but found only static. The fog seemed to muffle everything, creating a cocoon of isolation around my truck. Even my CB radio, usually alive with chatter from other drivers, produced nothing but an empty hiss. I was alone with my counting engine, and the growing certainty that something was very wrong. I decided to push on, hoping to reach the next truck stop before whatever was happening got worse. The engine continued its methodical progression, each number announced with mechanical precision. 7 pulses, 8 pulses, 9 pulses, and then, just as I was wondering what would happen when it reached 10, the counting stopped. The sudden silence was almost worse than the strange sounds had been. My engine continued to run, but now it seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something. The fog pressed closer against my windshield, and I had the unsettling feeling that something was pressing back from the other side, trying to see in. My wipers squealed against the glass, clearing brief crescents of visibility before the gray wall closed in again. That's when I saw the lights ahead. At first, I thought it was another truck, maybe pulled over with mechanical trouble, but as I drew closer, I realized the lights were wrong. They were too dim, too yellow, and they flickered with an irregular rhythm that made my eyes water. They seemed to be coming from an old truck, something from the 70s maybe, with the high-mounted headlights and tall exhaust stacks of the classic big rigs. But there was something off about its proportions, as if it had been stretched or distorted somehow. I slowed down, planning to offer assistance if needed. It's an unwritten rule of the road that truckers help each other, especially on nights like this, when the world feels particularly hostile to anyone trying to make an honest living hauling freight. But as I pulled alongside, my own headlights illuminating the other vehicle, I felt my blood turn to ice water. The truck was old, all right, ancient. Rust had eaten through the cab like cancer, leaving holes that should have made it impossible to drive. The paint had faded to a sickly green-gray, and strange symbols were painted along the trailer sides, symbols that seemed to writhe and shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. But it was the driver that made me slam on my brakes so hard that my load shifted and groaned behind me. There was no driver, just an empty seat, and yet the truck was moving, keeping perfect pace with the flow of traffic that didn't exist. The steering wheel turned by itself, guided by invisible hands, and I could see the gear shifter moving through its positions with practiced precision. The dashboard was lit up with gauges and warning lights that had been obsolete for decades, and they pulsed in the same rhythm my own engine had been using to count. I grabbed my CB mic with shaking hands and called out, "Breaker 19, this is Redwood Runner. Anybody copy?" Nothing but static answered me, but on the silent channel, I began to hear something else. Counting, not the mechanical counting of my engine, but a human voice, deep and gravelly with years of diesel exhaust and cigarettes. 7. The ghost truck began to accelerate, and I watched in horror as my own speedometer started climbing without any input from me. My foot was off the accelerator, but we were both picking up speed, racing through the fog toward some unknown destination. The counting voice grew louder, more insistent. 7, 8, 9, 7. And I realized with growing terror that my engine was synchronizing with it, joining in the count with its mechanical pulses. We were racing now, two trucks locked in some supernatural convoy, and the fog was beginning to thin ahead of us, revealing glimpses of a landscape that wasn't quite right. The road signs were wrong, advertising towns that didn't exist. The guardrails were made of materials I didn't recognize, and the pavement beneath my wheels felt different, softer somehow, as if it might give way at any moment. We passed other vehicles, or what might have been vehicles once, all of them empty, all of them keeping pace with our impossible convoy. The voice on the CB was getting more agitated now, straining to reach that final number but never quite making it. 9. And each time it failed, my engine would respond with its own frustrated mechanical cry, as if they were having some kind of conversation in a language I couldn't understand. I tried everything I could think of. I downshifted, I hit the brakes, I even tried turning off the engine entirely. Nothing worked. My truck had become part of something larger, caught in the wake of that ghostly big rig, like a boat caught in a current. The speedometer climbed past 70, then 80 speeds that should have been impossible on this winding coastal highway. That's when I remembered something my grandfather had told me, back when he was teaching me to drive his old Ford pickup on the farm. He'd been a trucker too, back in the days when the highways were newer and the trucks were simpler. He used to tell stories about drivers who'd disappeared, trucks found empty by the roadside with engines still running. Sometimes, he'd said, the road takes payment for safe passage, but it's always hungry for more. I reached for my CB, and instead of trying to call for help, I began to count along with the voice. 7, 8, 9. The ghost truck seemed to slow slightly, as if it was listening. 7. The voice on the CB let out a sound that might have been relief or rage, I couldn't tell which, and then, with a sound like reality tearing apart, the entire convoy simply vanished. I found myself alone on Highway 101, my truck coasting to a stop in a perfectly normal patch of fog. My engine was quiet now, running smooth and steady as it had for the past 300,000 miles. The CB crackled back to life with normal trucker chatter, and I could see the reassuring glow of civilization ahead. But I noticed something that made my hands tremble as I reached for the gear shifter. My odometer had jumped, the morning tread, from Marcus Wheeler. The interstate stretched before me like a black ribbon stitched across the Nebraska plains, my 18-wheeler cutting through the darkness at a steady 70 miles per hour. I'd been running this route between Omaha and Denver for the better part of 15 years, and the familiar hum of my Peterbilt's engine had become as comforting as a lullaby. The dashboard clock glowed a soft green, reading 2:47 a.m., and I was making good time despite the light drizzle that had started an hour back near the Colorado border. That's when I first heard it. At first I thought it was just the wet asphalt singing beneath my tires, that familiar whisper of rubber meeting rain-slicked concrete. But as I rolled down my window to get some fresh air, the sound became clearer, more distinct. It wasn't the usual road noise at all. It was something else entirely, something that made the hair on my forearms stand up despite the warm June night. My tires were crying, not metaphorically, not in some poetic sense that truckers sometimes use when talking about the lonesome highway. They were actually producing sounds that resembled human sobs, soft and mournful, rising and falling with each revolution. The sound was most pronounced from my rear tandems, those big drive tires that had carried me across 250,000 miles of American road. I'd put those Michelins on just 3 months ago in Kansas City, and they'd been nothing but reliable until now. I eased off the throttle, letting the big rig coast down from 70 to 60, then to 55. The crying didn't diminish with the reduced speed. If anything, it seemed to grow more distinct, more human-like. I could hear what sounded like sniffling, the kind of quiet weeping you might hear from a child who's trying not to disturb sleeping parents. The digital clock flicked over to 2:52 a.m. as I guided the truck toward the shoulder, my hazard lights painting the prairie grass in rhythmic amber flashes. The rain had stopped, leaving the air thick with the smell of wet earth and ozone. I set the parking brake and let the engine idle, sitting in the cab for a long moment, listening. The crying continued, a soft chorus of rubber voices that seemed to be coming from all around the truck now, not just the rear wheels. I grabbed my flashlight from the door pocket and climbed down from the cab, my boots splashing in a shallow puddle. The night was eerily quiet except for the distant rumble of an occasional vehicle passing on the interstate and the gentle weeping that seemed to emanate from my truck's undercarriage. I walked slowly around the perimeter, playing my flashlight beam across each wheel. The tires looked perfectly normal. No visible damage, no unusual wear patterns, no obvious reason for the supernatural sounds they were producing. But the crying continued, and as I crouched beside the front passenger tire, I could swear I heard something else mixed in with the sobs. Whispers, so faint they might have been imagination, but they're nonetheless. "Help us," the voice seemed to say, barely audible above the night wind. So cold, so dark. I stood up quickly, nearly dropping my flashlight. 43 years old, and I'd never been one to believe in ghosts or supernatural nonsense, but there was no denying what I was hearing. The voices were coming from inside the tires themselves. As impossible as that seemed, multiple voices now, men and women, old and young, all crying and whispering in harmony. The dashboard clock read exactly 3:00 a.m. when I climbed back into the cab, my hands trembling slightly as I reached for my CB radio. Channel 19 crackled to life, and I keyed the microphone with sweaty fingers. "Breaker 19, this is Freight Train Marcus. Anybody out there got their ears on?" Static filled the cab for several seconds before a gravelly voice responded. "Freight Train, this is Moondog running westbound at the 270 marker. You sound a little shook up there, driver." I hesitated, knowing how crazy I was about to sound. "Moondog, this might seem like a strange question, but have you ever heard of tires, well, that make unusual sounds at night?" A long pause. "What kind of sounds, Marcus? Like crying, human crying?" The silence stretched so long I thought I'd lost the connection. Finally, Moondog's voice came back, lower now, more serious. "Where exactly are you parked, Freight Train?" I gave him my mile marker, and another lengthy pause followed. When he spoke again, there was something different in his tone, a weight that hadn't been there before. "Marcus, you need to get back on the road right now. Don't ask questions, don't investigate any further. Just fire that truck up and roll. There's a truck stop about 20 miles west of your position. Head there and don't stop for anything." "What's going on, Moondog? What do you know about this?" "We'll talk at the truck stop." The urgency in his voice convinced me more than his words. I released the parking brake and eased back onto the interstate, the crying of my tires now accompanied by what sounded like moaning, a chorus of anguish that followed me down the highway. As I accelerated, the sounds grew more intense, more desperate, as if the voices trapped within the rubber were pleading with me not to abandon them. Miles rolled by in a haze of supernatural dread. The speedometer held steady at 65, but the crying never ceased. Occasionally, I caught fragments of words or phrases rising above the general lament. Names, mostly: Sarah, Michael, Elizabeth, Tommy. A litany of identities spoken in voices full of longing and loss. The truck stop appeared ahead like a glowing island in the darkness, its neon signs reflecting off the wet pavement in pools of blue and red. I guided the Peterbilt into the parking area and found a space near the back, away from the other trucks. As soon as I set the parking brake, the crying stopped abruptly, leaving only the familiar tick of cooling metal and the distant hum of highway traffic. Moondog found me in the driver's lounge. 20 minutes later, a thin man with silver hair and eyes that had seen too much of the road. He settled into the chair across from me with a cup of black coffee and studied my face for a long moment. "You heard them clear as day, didn't you?" he said finally. I nodded, not trusting my voice. "Happened to me about 10 years ago. Same stretch of highway, same time of night, 3 a.m. Exactly. Done some research since then, talked to other drivers who've experienced it. Always the same story. Always that section of road between miles 240 and 270. What is it?" I managed to ask. Moondog leaned back in his chair, his fingers wrapped around the coffee cup like he was trying to warm them. Near as I can figure, there was an accident back in the 80s. Multi-car pileup during a blizzard. 7 vehicles involved. 12 people killed. State scraped up what was left of the cars and trucks, but the rubber from all those blown tires got mixed in with the road surface when they repaved the section. The implications of what he was suggesting sent a chill down my spine. "You're saying the voices, the folks who died in that crash, somehow bound to the rubber that was ground into the asphalt. When truck tires roll over that section at exactly 3 a.m., something connects. The dead recognize the living, and they reach out." I thought about the names I'd heard whispered in the darkness. Sarah, Michael, Elizabeth, Tommy. "How do you know all this?" "They've had reports over the years, but nothing they can act on. Can't very well tear up 20 miles of interstate, because truck drivers claim to hear ghosts." We sat in silence for several minutes, the fluorescent lights humming overhead. Finally I asked the question that had been forming in my mind since I'd first heard those pitiful sobs. "What do they want?" "You what?" Moondog's expression grew distant, and when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Same thing any lost soul wants, I suppose. To be remembered, to be acknowledged. Maybe just to know that someone cares they existed." I left the truck stop an hour later with Moondog's contact information and a promise to call if I experienced anything else unusual. The remainder of my run to Denver passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the memory of those crying voices, the desperate whispers that seemed to echo from within my tires. I'd planned my timing carefully, making sure I'd pass through that stretch of highway well before the package that wouldn't stay still till from Marcus Chen. The interstate stretched before me like a black ribbon under the November moon, and I'd been driving for 14 hours straight when the call came through my CB radio. Dispatch had a last-minute pickup, they said, something that needed to reach Portland by dawn, and the regular driver had called in sick. The pay was double my usual rate, which should have been my first warning, but mortgage payments have a way of drowning out common sense. I pulled my Kenworth into the loading dock of Meridian Logistics just after midnight, the engine's familiar rumble echoing off the concrete walls of the warehouse district. The place looked deserted except for a single loading bay bathed in harsh fluorescent light, where a man in a wrinkled suit waited beside a wooden crate about the size of a refrigerator. He had the kind of pale, sweaty complexion that suggested he spent too much time indoors, and his handshake felt cold and damp when he approached my cab. It wasn't a question, and something about his tone made the hair on my arm stand up beneath my flannel shirt. The night air carried the scent of rain and diesel fuel, but underneath it lurked something else, something organic and unpleasant, that reminded me of meat left too long in the sun. The crate itself looked ordinary enough, constructed of rough pine boards and secured with heavy metal bands. But as the forklift operator maneuvered it into my trailer, I could have sworn I heard something shift inside, like sand pouring from one end to the other. When I mentioned it to the pale man, he just smiled and assured me that the contents were properly contained, whatever that meant. The paperwork listed the cargo as biological specimens for research purposes, which didn't tell me much, but I'd hauled stranger things in my 20 years on the road. As I secured the load with tie-down straps, the crate seemed to settle with a soft thud that resonated through the trailer floor. The sound had an odd quality to it, almost organic, like a heartbeat slowing to a stop. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting dancing shadows that made the wooden surface appear to ripple and move. I chalked it up to fatigue and climbed back into my cab, eager to put some miles between myself and that unsettling warehouse. The first few hours passed without incident as I rolled north through the Oregon countryside, my headlights carving a tunnel through the darkness while classic rock played softly on the radio. The familiar rhythm of the road began to work its magic, and I found myself relaxing into the meditative trance that comes with long-haul driving. Rain began to spatter against my windshield around 3 in the morning, just light drops at first, then building to a steady drumming that required the wipers to sweep back and forth in their hypnotic dance. At first I thought it was just the rain on the trailer roof, or maybe some loose cargo shifting with the road's gentle curves. But as I listened more carefully, I realized it was something else entirely, a soft scraping noise that seemed to come from inside the wooden crate, like fingernails dragging across rough wood. I turned down the radio and strained to hear over the engine noise and the whisper of tires on wet asphalt. The scraping continued for several miles, sometimes fading to almost nothing, then returning with renewed intensity. During one particularly long straightaway, I could have sworn I heard the metal bands around the crate creaking, as if something inside was pushing against them with considerable force. I pulled over at the next truck stop and walked back to check my load, my flashlight beam dancing across the trailer's interior walls as rain pelted my shoulders and dripped from the brim of my cap. But as I played my light across its surface, I noticed something that made my stomach clench with unease. The wood grain seemed different somehow, the natural patterns in the pine boards appearing to flow and shift like water whenever the light wasn't directly on them. When I focused the beam on one particular board, it looked perfectly normal, but in my peripheral vision, the entire crate seemed to pulse and breathe like something alive. After all, I'd been driving for over 18 hours with only brief stops for fuel and coffee, and fatigue can make anyone see things that aren't there. I climbed back into my cab and continued north, but the scraping sounds grew more frequent and more insistent, accompanied now by what sounded almost like whispers, too faint to make out individual words but unmistakably vocal in their cadence. The rain intensified as I climbed into the Cascade foothills, turning the highway into a river of reflected light from oncoming traffic. My wipers struggled to keep the windshield clear, and I had to slow to 40 miles per hour just to maintain control on the slick asphalt. It was during one particularly treacherous curve that I felt the trailer shift behind me, not the normal sway of a heavy load adjusting to centrifugal force, but something more deliberate, as if the cargo had suddenly redistributed itself from one side of the crate to the other. I pulled over at the next wide spot in the road and walked back through the driving rain to investigate. What I found there still haunts my dreams months later. The wooden crate had changed shape, its rectangular form now bulging outward in places where no bulges had been before, the pine boards warped and stressed as if enormous pressure was being applied from within. The metal bands had stretched to accommodate the new dimensions, and in several places dark liquid seeped between the boards, too thick to be water and too dark to be anything wholesome. The scraping sounds had evolved into something that resembled scratching, dozens of sharp objects dragging across the interior walls of the crate in a rhythm that almost sounded like coded communication. As I stood there in the rain, water dripping from my soaked clothing, I heard my name being whispered from inside that wooden prison, spoken in voices that seemed to layer and overlap like a twisted chorus. The sound of my own name, repeated over and over in tones that ranged from pleading to angry to something that might have been hungry. I should have abandoned the load right there, should have called dispatch and told them to send someone else to deal with whatever nightmare I was hauling through the Oregon mountains. But the professional driver in me, the part that had never missed a delivery in 2 decades on the road, urged me to press forward. Portland was less than 100 miles away, and dawn was already beginning to lighten the eastern sky behind the storm clouds. I could make the delivery and be done with this job before the morning rush hour began. The final stretch of highway descended through dense forest, where Douglas firs pressed close to the roadway like silent sentinels. My headlights caught occasional glimpses of wildlife, deer and elk standing at the forest edge, with eyes that reflected the light in brief, eerie flashes. The rain had softened to a gentle mist that made everything look ethereal and dreamlike, and I found myself fighting to stay alert as the rhythmic thrum of tires on pavement threatened to lull me into microsleeps. Behind me the cargo had grown quiet again, but not the peaceful quiet of inanimate objects secured for transport. This was the tense silence of predators waiting for the perfect moment to strike, and I could feel hostile attention focused on the back of my neck like a physical weight. Every few minutes I glanced in my mirrors to check the trailer, but all I could see was darkness punctuated by my running lights and the faint glow of dawn creeping across the sky. As I crested the final hill before the descent into Portland, the morning sun broke through the cloud cover and painted the landscape in shades of gold and amber. The beauty of the moment was shattered by a tremendous crash from my trailer, the sound of splintering wood and snapping metal that told me my cargo had finally broken free of its wooden prison. I felt the trailer lurch as whatever had been inside that crate began moving around the space, and I could hear what sounded like dozens of separate entities scrabbling against the aluminum wall. I accelerated down the hill toward the delivery address, desperate now to be rid of my cargo before it found a way to breach the trailer itself. The scratching sounds intensified, joined by a wet slithering noise that made my skin crawl, and I could feel the trailer swaying as the freed contents shifted their weight from side to side. In my mirrors I caught glimpses of dark fluid seeping from beneath the trailer door, leaving a trail of stains on the asphalt behind me. The delivery address turned out to be another warehouse in an industrial district, but this one was bustling with activity despite the early hour. Men in hazmat suits waited beside a specialized containment vehicle, and they swarmed my trailer the moment I backed up to their loading dock. They were the manifest that manifests, from Jake Henley. The CB radio crackled with the usual late-night chatter as I guided my Peterbilt through the winding mountain passes of northern Idaho, the diesel engine purring like a contented beast beneath the hood. 23 years I'd been hauling freight across these highways, and I thought I'd seen every kind of cargo imaginable, from livestock to luxury cars, from hazardous chemicals to harmless household goods. But the load I picked up that foggy Tuesday evening from a warehouse outside Coeur d'Alene would prove to be unlike anything I'd ever transported. 3 pallets of what the paperwork described as archival materials, bound for a private collector in Missoula. The warehouse supervisor, a nervous man with ink-stained fingers and thick glasses, had watched with unusual intensity as the forklift operators loaded the cargo into my trailer. Each pallet was wrapped in heavy brown paper and secured with an excessive amount of tape, sealed so thoroughly that I couldn't make out the shapes beneath. The supervisor handed me the clipboard with trembling hands, his eyes darting between my face and the back of the truck as if he expected something to leap out at any moment. The weight distribution felt odd as I pulled away from the loading dock. Not heavy exactly, but somehow dense in a way that seemed to settle deep into the trailer's frame. The evening mist clung to my windshield like ghostly fingers, and I had to run the wipers constantly just to maintain visibility through the serpentine mountain roads. My headlights carved twin tunnels through the gray soup of fog, occasionally catching glimpses of pine trees that loomed like silent sentinels on either side of the asphalt. About 3 hours into the drive, somewhere past the town of Wallace, I pulled into a truck stop to grab some coffee and check my logbook. The place was nearly deserted except for a couple of other drivers catching some sleep in their cabs, and a lone attendant who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. As I filled out the required entries in my logbook, I noticed something peculiar about the manifest I'd been given. Where it had originally listed archival materials in neat, typed letters, There now appeared to be additional text scrawled in faded pencil beneath the original description. The words were difficult to make out in the harsh fluorescent lighting of the truck stop, but they seemed to read correspondence, ongoing in an old-fashioned copper-plate handwriting that definitely hadn't been there when I'd accepted the load. I rubbed my eyes and looked again, wondering if the long hours in mountain fog were playing tricks on my vision, but the additional text remained clearly visible. The pencil marks appeared aged, as if they'd been there for decades rather than hours. A chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air crept up my spine as I traced the words with my finger, feeling the subtle impression the pencil had left in the paper. The handwriting was elegant but somehow urgent, as if whoever had written it had been pressed for time or struggling with some inner turmoil. Back on the road, the CB radio seemed to pick up strange interference that sounded almost like whispered conversations, just beyond the range of comprehension. I adjusted the squelch and tried different channels, but the phantom voices persisted, weaving in and out of the static like smoke through screen wire. The fog had thickened considerably, reducing my visibility to mere yards ahead of the truck, and I found myself driving by instinct, as much as sight through the familiar curves and grades of the mountain highway. When I stopped at a way station about 50 miles later, I decided to take another look at the manifest, partly out of curiosity and partly because something about the cargo was making me increasingly uneasy. The paper felt different in my hands now, somehow more substantial, as if it had gained weight and texture during the journey. The original typed text was still there, but the handwritten edition had changed. Instead of correspondence, ongoing, it now read letters from the other side in the same elegant script, though the ink appeared darker and more distinct than before. My hands began to shake as I stared at the document under the dome light of my cab. This wasn't possible, I told myself. Paper doesn't change by itself. Ink doesn't darken on its own. But even as I tried to rationalize what I was seeing, more text began to appear on the manifest before my eyes. Words formed slowly, as if an invisible hand were writing them in real time. "We know you're reading this," the new text said. "We've been waiting so long for someone to carry our words." The manifest continued to fill with text, the handwriting becoming more frantic and desperate with each passing moment. "Please don't ignore us like the others. We have so much to say, so many messages that never reached their destinations. Help us finish what we started." I fumbled for my cell phone to take pictures of the changing document, but the screen remained stubbornly black, no matter how many times I pressed the power button. The battery had been fully charged when I left the warehouse, but now the device seemed completely dead. The CB radio had gone silent as well, not even producing the usual static that served as white noise during long hauls. The only sound was the idle of my engine and the whisper of fog against the windshield, creating an isolation so complete it felt like being sealed inside a tomb. The manifest now covered both sides with cramped, urgent handwriting that spoke of love letters never sent, business correspondence that could have changed lives, confessions that died with their authors, and apologies that arrived too late. The writers seemed desperate for acknowledgement, for someone to witness their words and perhaps carry their messages forward into the world of the living. "You're our courier now," one passage read. "You understand the importance of delivery. Please don't let us remain undelivered forever." As I sat there in the swirling fog, surrounded by the growing weight of all those unspoken communications, I began to understand what I was truly carrying in my trailer. These weren't just archival materials. They were the repository of human connection, the physical manifestation of all the words that people had tried to send to each other across the years. And somehow, impossibly, those words were still alive, still seeking their intended recipients, still hoping to bridge the gaps between hearts and minds and souls. The truck began to rock gently, as if something in the trailer was shifting and moving, responding to my growing awareness of what lay behind those heavily taped pallets. The manifest in my hands grew warm, almost hot, and more text appeared with increasing speed. Names and addresses, dates spanning decades, Snippets of conversations that painted pictures of entire lives lived in the spaces between hello and goodbye. The handwriting styles changed constantly, reflecting different eras, different hands, different hearts, all united in their desire to be heard and understood. I started the engine and pulled back onto the highway, suddenly desperate to reach Missoula and deliver this impossible cargo to whatever destination awaited it. But as I drove through the fog-shrouded mountains, I realized that the manifest was still changing, still accumulating new messages, and some of them, I noticed with a growing sense of unease, were addressed to me, to my name, my address, written in hands I didn't recognize but somehow felt familiar. Messages from people I'd never met, thanking me for carrying their words, welcoming me into their strange community of eternal correspondence. But when I looked down at the manifest one final time, it had returned to its original state, showing only the typed description of archival materials in neat professional lettering. No trace remained of the handwritten messages that had covered every inch of the paper throughout the night. My cell phone chirped back to life, showing a full battery and several missed calls from my dispatch. I delivered the cargo to the address specified on the original manifest, a small warehouse on the industrial side of town, where an elderly woman signed for the pallets, without comment or question. She handled the paperwork with the same ink-stained fingers I'd noticed on the supervisor back in Coeur d'Alene, and her eyes held the same nervous intensity as she watched me drive away. But the story doesn't end with that delivery, because even now, weeks later, I still find handwritten messages appearing in my logbook, on my fuel receipts, on any piece of paper that travels with me in the cab. Short notes, usually, expressions of gratitude from correspondents I'll never meet, invitations to carry more messages, and sometimes, most disturbing of all, letters addressed to me from people whose names I recognize from tombstones in cemeteries I pass on my routes. The freight that writes back, it seems, has made me part of its endless network of communication, and I'm no longer sure if I'm the courier or just another sender hoping someone somewhere will receive my words and understand that some messages are too important to let distance or even death keep them from finding their way home. The Sandman's Rate. You, from Jake Morrison. You. The thing about long-haul trucking is that sleep becomes your most precious currency, and like any valuable thing, it can be stolen from you when you least expect it. I've been running these highways for 12 years now, my Peterbilt 37.9 humming beneath me, like a steel lullaby, but I'd never encountered anything quite like what happened on that stretch of Interstate 80 through Nevada last month. The memory still makes my hands shake when I grip the steering wheel too tight, still makes me check my mirrors more often than any sane driver should. I was 3 days into a cross-country haul, carrying electronics from California to a distribution center in Ohio, and my logbook was telling me I needed rest whether my body agreed or not. The Department of Transportation doesn't care if you feel wide awake at 2 in the morning. They care about those little numbers in your book, and mine said I had exactly 47 minutes left on my driving clock before I'd be in violation. The Nevada desert stretched endlessly on both sides of the highway, a moonlit expanse of sagebrush and shadows that seemed to swallow the beam of my headlights. My CB radio crackled occasionally with distant chatter from other drivers, their voices thin and ghostly across the static. The fuel gauge showed 3/4 full, my engine temperature was steady, and everything should have felt normal. Should have, but didn't. There's something unsettling about driving through the desert at night, something that gets under your skin and makes you question what you're seeing in the periphery of your vision. The darkness out there isn't like city darkness, where streetlights and neon signs create pockets of familiarity. Desert darkness is complete, absolute, the kind that makes you realize how small and insignificant your truck really is against the vastness of the world. I spotted the rest area about 10 miles ahead, its sign illuminated by a single flickering fluorescent that cast nervous shadows across the weathered metal. Willow Springs Rest Area. Next right. It read, though I couldn't imagine any willows surviving in this desolate landscape. The exit ramp curved gently away from the highway, leading to a small parking area with restrooms, a few picnic tables, and a scattering of overhead lights that buzzed with electrical persistence. 3 other trucks were already parked in the designated spaces, their running lights glowing like red eyes in the darkness. A blue Kenworth with Michigan plates sat closest to the restrooms, its driver presumably inside catching some mandated sleep. Next to it, a white Freightliner with a refrigerated trailer hummed quietly, keeping whatever cargo it carried at the proper temperature. The third truck, a red Mack, sat dark and silent at the far end of the lot. I chose a spot between the Kenworth and the Freightliner, close enough to the other drivers for that unspoken sense of security that truckers share, but far enough away to avoid disturbing anyone. The engine's rumble faded to silence as I turned the key, and suddenly the night seemed much larger, much more present. I could hear the desert wind whistling around the cab, the distant hum of the refrigerated unit, and something else, something I couldn't quite identify. It sounded almost like humming, but not mechanical, human, but not quite right. The melody seemed familiar yet strange, like a lullaby heard through water, or recalled from a half-forgotten dream. I rolled down my window slightly, trying to locate the source, but the sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. My sleeper berth was comfortable enough, equipped with a firm mattress and blackout curtains that blocked out most of the ambient light from the rest area. I'd made the space my home away from home over the years, decorating it with a few photos of my family and a small collection of paperback novels. Tonight, though, something felt different about it. The walls seemed closer somehow, the ceiling lower, as if the space were slowly contracting around me. I checked my watch, 11:37 p.m., and calculated that I could sleep until 6 a.m. and still make my delivery on time. 8.5 hours of rest should have been plenty, should have left me refreshed and alert for the remaining miles ahead. I pulled the curtains closed, adjusted my pillow, and tried to let the familiar sounds of the truck stop lull me toward sleep. Despite my exhaustion, despite the comfortable bed and the quiet surroundings, my mind remained stubbornly alert. Every small sound seemed amplified in the darkness. The settling of the truck's metal as it cooled, the whisper of wind through the gap in my window, and underneath it all, that strange humming that seemed to grow stronger rather than fade. After what felt like an hour of restless tossing, I decided to check on the other drivers, maybe strike up a conversation to pass the time until sleep finally claimed me. Truckers are generally friendly folks, especially during the lonely hours of the night, and sometimes talking through whatever's keeping you awake is the best medicine. The night air was surprisingly cold, carrying with it the scent of sage and something else, something sweet and cloying that reminded me of flowers left too long in stagnant water. The overhead lights buzzed and flickered intermittently, casting unstable shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. The driver was either sleeping soundly or not in the truck at all. I tapped gently on the driver's door and called out softly, "Hey there, everything all right?" but received no response. The silence that followed my words seemed heavier than it should have been, as if the night itself were swallowing sound. The white Freightliner showed similar signs of abandonment. Its refrigerator unit continued to hum mechanically, but there was no sign of life in the cab. No snoring, no movement, nothing to indicate a sleeping driver within. A chill that had nothing to do with the desert air began to work its way up my spine as I approached the red Mack at the far end of the lot. This truck was completely dark and silent, sitting like a massive shadow against the star-filled sky. As I drew closer, I could see that the driver's door was slightly ajar, hanging open just enough to suggest that someone had left in a hurry or without properly securing it. The cab was empty, the sleeper berth curtains pulled back to reveal rumpled bedding, but no occupant. That's when I noticed the footprints in the dust around the trucks. Dozens of them, all leading in the same direction toward a path that disappeared into the desert darkness beyond the rest area's lights. The prints were bare feet, men's and women's, children's and adults, all heading away from the parking lot as if following some silent summons into the wasteland. The humming grew stronger, more distinct, and I realized it was coming from the direction the footprints led. It was definitely human voices now, a chorus of them, singing something that sounded like a lullaby but felt wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. The melody was hypnotic, beautiful in its way, but underneath the beauty was something that made my skin crawl and my heart rate increase. I should have gotten back in my truck right then, should have fired up the engine and gotten back on the highway, regardless of what my logbook said. But curiosity and concern for my fellow drivers kept my feet moving forward, following those strange footprints into the darkness beyond the circle of artificial light. The path was barely visible, more of a depression in the sandy soil than an actual trail, but the footprints were clear enough in the loose dirt. They led between two large outcroppings of rock and down into a shallow valley that hadn't been visible from the rest area. The humming grew stronger with each step, accompanied now by what sounded like whispered words in a language I didn't recognize. Around the stones, figures moved in a slow, rhythmic dance, their movements synchronized with the haunting melody that filled the night air. I recognized the 3 missing truck drivers among them, along with dozens of other people, all walking in that same dreamy, purposeful circle. Their eyes were closed, every one of them, but they moved with perfect coordination as if guided by some invisible force. The humming came from their throats, a collective lullaby that seemed to vibrate in my bones and make my eyelids heavy despite my fear. I felt an almost overwhelming urge to step forward, to join the circle, to let that beautiful, terrible song carry me away from all my worries and responsibility. Bodies, dozens of them, lying in peaceful reflections at mile marker 2. From Marcus Chen to that yeah. The Peterbilt's diesel engine hummed its familiar lullaby as I rolled down Interstate 64, somewhere between the Kentucky border and Louisville, in the thick of October night. 23 years I'd been driving these highways, hauling everything from auto parts to frozen goods across the continental United States, and I thought I knew every rest stop, every truck plaza, every lonely stretch of asphalt between the Atlantic and Pacific. The dashboard clock glowed a pale green 2:47 a.m., and my eyes were starting to feel like sandpaper despite the thermos of coffee wedged between my seats. The load of electronics I was carrying to Memphis could wait another hour or two for a proper rest break. That's when I saw the sign illuminated by my headlights for just a moment as it flashed past. Clean white lettering on that familiar brown background. Rest area 1 mile. I didn't remember this particular stop from previous runs along this route, but highway departments were always building new facilities, and my tired mind was probably just playing tricks on me. The gentle patter of rain that had started an hour ago was now drumming more insistently against the windshield, and the rhythmic sweep of the wipers was making my eyelids even heavier. A rest stop would be exactly what I needed. The off-ramp curved gently to the right, descending through a tunnel of overhanging oak trees, whose bare branches scraped against the trailer with soft scratching sound. The pavement here seemed newer than the interstate, still black and smooth without the usual cracks and patches you'd expect on a secondary road. As I rounded the final curve, the rest stop opened before me like something from a dream. It was larger than most, with a modern building sitting in the center of a spacious parking area, all of it bathed in the warm amber glow of perfectly spaced streetlights. What struck me immediately was how clean everything looked, almost pristine, as if it had been built yesterday and was seeing its first visitors tonight. The rain had softened to a gentle mist that caught the light like tiny diamonds in the air. Through the windshield I could see the rest stop's main building, and something about its design made me pause. The entire structure appeared to be made of glass and steel, with floor-to-ceiling windows wrapping around all sides. But as I looked more closely, adjusting my eyes to the lighting, I realized those weren't windows at all. They were mirrors. Every single exterior wall was covered in perfectly polished mirror panels that reflected the parking lot, the lights, and my own truck back at me in crystalline clarity. The effect was disorienting, creating an endless series of reflections that seemed to stretch into infinity. My Peterbilt appeared to multiply across the mirrored surfaces. Dozens of identical rigs, parked in dozens of identical lots, under dozens of identical amber lights. I rubbed my eyes, attributing the strange visual effect to fatigue, and grabbed my jacket from behind the seat. The building must have windows on the inside, I reasoned. The mirrors were probably just an architectural choice, maybe designed to make the structure blend into its surroundings during daylight hours. As I stepped down from the cab, my boots splashed softly in a shallow puddle, and I could hear the gentle tick-tick-tick of the engine beginning to cool. The air smelled clean and fresh, washed by the rain, with just a hint of that distinctive highway scent of diesel and wet asphalt. Walking toward the building, I found myself unconsciously avoiding eye contact with my own reflection, though I couldn't quite explain why. There was something unsettling about seeing myself multiplied across all those mirrored surfaces, as if I were walking through a funhouse designed by someone with very sophisticated taste. The entrance was clearly marked with standard rest stop signage, and as I approached, automatic doors slid open with a soft whisper. Inside, the space was even more remarkable than the exterior had suggested. The interior walls were also mirrored, every single surface reflecting back the soft fluorescent lighting and creating an environment that seemed to extend infinitely in all directions. It was like stepping inside a kaleidoscope, where every angle revealed another reflection, another perspective, another layer of visual depth that made it difficult to judge the actual size of the room. The facilities were exactly what you'd expect in a modern rest stop. Clean restrooms clearly marked with standard signage, a small seating area with comfortable-looking chairs and a few vending machines, humming quietly in an alcove. Everything was spotless and well-maintained, but the mirrors made navigation surprisingly challenging. Every surface reflected every other surface, creating a maze of visual information that made it hard to tell which direction you were actually facing. I had to move slowly and deliberately, using the floor tiles as a reference point to maintain my orientation. After taking care of business and washing my hands in a restroom that felt like an infinity chamber of porcelain and chrome, I decided to sit for a few minutes in the seating area. The chairs were more comfortable than expected, and I leaned back to rest my eyes and let the caffeine from my earlier coffee work its way out of my system. That's when I began to notice the subtle wrongness that had been nagging at the edges of my consciousness since I'd first stepped inside. In all those mirrors, in all those endless reflections stretching away into visual infinity, I could see myself clearly from every conceivable angle. Multiple versions of me sitting in identical chairs, wearing the same faded denim jacket and work boots, looking tired after a long night of driving. But as I sat there, letting my eyes wander across the mirrored surfaces, I began to realize that not all of my reflections were doing exactly the same things at exactly the same time. A reflection of me 3 layers deep would seem to move his hand just a fraction of a second before I moved mine. Another version, visible in a mirror that reflected another mirror that reflected another mirror, would tilt his head slightly in a direction I hadn't tilted mine. At first I attributed these discrepancies to optical illusions, to the complex interplay of light and reflection, creating false impressions of movement. The human eye wasn't designed to process this much visual information simultaneously, and fatigue was probably making me see things that weren't really there. A reflection of me 5 layers deep stood up while I remained seated. Another version, far back in the infinite recession of mirrors, seemed to be looking directly at me while I was looking in a completely different direction. The wrongness of it made my skin crawl, like insects walking up my spine with tiny cold feet. Every rational part of my mind insisted that this was impossible, that reflections were simply photons bouncing off silvered glass, that they couldn't possibly act independently of the objects they were reflecting. I stood up quickly, suddenly eager to return to the familiar confines of my truck, but movement only made the situation worse. Now, dozens of versions of me were moving through the mirrored space, and they were no longer moving in unison. Some walked faster than others. Some turned left when I turned right. Some stopped while others continued moving. It was like watching a crowd of strangers who happened to look exactly like me, each following their own agenda through their own version of this impossible space. The fluorescent lights above began to flicker, just barely perceptibly, creating subtle changes in the lighting that made the reflections shift and dance. The humming of the vending machines seemed to grow louder, taking on an almost musical quality that resonated strangely in the mirrored chamber. I moved quickly toward where I remembered the exit being, but the mirrors made navigation nearly impossible. Every direction looked the same. Every surface reflected every other surface, and I found myself walking in what felt like circles through an endless maze of my own image. One reflection, perhaps 7 or 8 layers deep in the mirrored infinity, had stopped moving entirely and was staring directly at me with an expression I had never worn. His eyes, my eyes, were filled with something that looked like desperate warning, his mouth moving as if he were trying to shout something I couldn't hear. He was pointing urgently toward one of the mirrored walls, gesturing for me to move in a direction that seemed, from my perspective, to lead deeper into the reflected maze, rather than toward any exit. I could see versions of myself turning to look at the pointing figure, some nodding in apparent understanding, others backing away as if frightened. The complex choreography of all these reflected movements was becoming overwhelming, a visual cacophony that made my head spin and my stomach lurch. The familiar solid ground of reality was shifting beneath my feet, replaced by this endless hall of mirrors, where the normal rules of physics seemed to have been suspended. I forced myself to ignore the reflections and focus on the physical reality around me, using my hands to feel along the walls until I found what felt like the door frame I had entered through. The automatic doors opened with their soft whisper, and I practically stumbled out into the rain-washed parking lot, grateful for the divine engine. Tyla. From Marcus Riley. I've been hauling freight across the Midwest for 23 years, and in all that time I've learned to trust my instincts about places that feel wrong. That October night, pulling my Kenworth through the endless cornfields of Nebraska, every instinct I had should have told me to keep driving past Harmony Junction. Should have, but didn't, because sometimes what draws you in sounds like the most beautiful thing you've ever heard. The fuel gauge had been kissing empty for the last 40 miles, and my CB had been nothing but static since Omaha. The digital clock on my dashboard read 2:47 a.m. when I finally spotted the pale glow of a truck stop emerging from the darkness, like a ship on a black sea. The sign read Harmony Junction Travel Plaza in faded letters that seemed to shimmer in my headlights, though that might have been the fatigue playing tricks on my eye. I'd been driving for 16 hours straight, pushing the limits of what the logbooks would allow, chasing a delivery deadline that would make the difference between making my truck payment or explaining to the bank why I needed another extension. The parking lot was nearly empty, except for a couple of sleeping rigs and a lone sedan that looked like it had been sitting there since the Clinton administration. I maneuvered my rig toward the fuel island, the familiar diesel engine rumble echoing off the canopy above. The truck stop itself was one of those forgotten places that time seems to have skipped over, all fluorescent lighting and weather-beaten concrete, the kind of establishment that exists solely to serve the endless stream of travelers who need nothing more than fuel, caffeine, and a clean restroom before disappearing back into the night. As I climbed down from the cab, my boots hitting the oil-stained asphalt with a hollow thud, I noticed how unnaturally quiet everything was. No wind stirring the prairie grass beyond the lot, no distant highway noise, not even the usual electrical hum that accompanies these places, just silence, so complete it felt like being wrapped in cotton. The air carried that crisp October bite that promised winter wasn't far behind, and I pulled my jacket tighter as I approached the fuel pump. That's when I first heard it. Instead, it was producing something that sounded almost like music. A low, harmonic vibration that seemed to rise and fall in patterns too deliberate to be accidental. I paused with my credit card halfway to the reader, listening more carefully. The sound was coming from deep within the pump mechanism, but it had a resonance that seemed to fill the air around me, like standing inside a cathedral organ pipe. 23 years on the road teaches you that the mind plays tricks when you're running on 4 hours of sleep and too much truck stop coffee. I swiped my card and began the familiar routine of fueling up, but the sound continued. If anything, it grew more complex as the diesel began flowing into my tank. The mechanical humming had transformed into something that sounded disturbingly like a hymn, complete with harmonies that seemed to shift and weave around each other in impossible ways. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It reminded me of the old gospel songs my grandmother used to sing while she cooked Sunday dinner, but there was something older underneath it, something that predated any religion I could name. The harmonies seemed to come from multiple sources, as if an entire choir was somehow hidden within the fuel pump's machinery, their voices blending and separating in complex patterns that made my chest vibrate with sympathetic resonance. I found myself swaying slightly to the rhythm, my eyes growing heavy despite the cold night air. The music seemed to seep into my bones, making me feel more relaxed than I had in weeks. The stress of deadlines and truck payments began to fade as the hymn-like melody washed over me. There was something profoundly peaceful about it, something that spoke to a part of me I'd forgotten existed since I started living my life in 6-hour driving increments and mandatory rest breaks. I stood there in the pale fluorescent light, listening to the impossible music pouring from the pump. The sound had evolved again, becoming more complex, more layered. I could distinguish individual voices now, each one perfect in pitch and timing. Some were deep bass notes that seemed to come from the earth itself, while others soared in soprano ranges that made me think of angels, if angels sang in gas stations in the middle of nowhere, Nebraska. The driver of one of the other trucks had emerged from his cab and was walking toward the fuel island with the slow, measured pace of someone in no particular hurry. Even in the dim light, I could see he was smiling, his face turned upward as if basking in sunshine instead of harsh fluorescent bulbs. Behind him, the driver of the second truck was doing the same thing, approaching with that same dreamy expression, that same unhurried gait. Neither of them seemed to notice me standing there with the fuel nozzle still in my hand, both transfixed by the hymn that continued to pour from the pump in waves of impossible harmony. As they drew closer, I could see their lips moving silently, as if they were singing along to a song they'd known all their lives. Their eyes were open but unfocused, looking through me rather than at me, seeing something I couldn't perceive. What had started as a gentle hymn was becoming something more demanding, more urgent. The harmonies were pulling at something deep in my chest, making me want to join in even though I didn't know the words. My grandmother's voice seemed to echo in my memory, calling me to sing along, to add my voice to the celestial chorus that was somehow emanating from a diesel fuel pump in the middle of the Nebraska prairie. I took a step closer to the pump, drawn by melodies that seemed to promise answers to questions I didn't even know I'd been asking. The music was beautiful beyond description, more moving than anything I'd heard in any church or concert hall. It spoke of peace and rest and an end to the endless miles of highway that stretched ahead of me like an eternal sentence. Why had I been fighting it? Why had I been trying to resist something so obviously perfect? The other two drivers had reached the fuel island now and were standing on either side of me, swaying gently to the rhythm of the hymn. Up close, I could see they'd been here much longer than I'd initially thought. Their clothes were wrinkled and stained, their hair unkempt. One of them had what looked like several days' worth of stubble, while the other's lips were cracked and dry. But both wore expressions of absolute contentment, lost in the music that seemed to grow more complex with each passing moment. That's when a part of my mind, the part that had kept me alive through ice storms and mountain passes and brake failures on steep grades, began to scream warnings I almost couldn't hear over the beautiful sound. I forced myself to look more carefully at my companion. The stubble on the first driver wasn't several days old, it was weeks old. His clothes weren't just wrinkled, they were deteriorating. And his truck, the one I'd assumed was simply parked for a mandatory rest break, had grass growing around its tire. The hymn reached a crescendo that made my vision blur with tears at its beauty, but I used those tears to see more clearly. The sedan I'd noticed earlier wasn't just old. It was rusted through in places, its windows clouded with age and weather. How long had these people been standing here, listening to the impossible music, slowly wasting away while the pump sang its eternal song? The hymn had wrapped around me like invisible chains, each note a link that bound me tighter to this place. The harmonies were inside my head now, drowning out rational thought, promising eternal peace if I would just stop fighting and let myself become part of the music. My grandmother's voice was clearer now, calling my name, telling me to come home, to rest, to stop running and be still. But 23 years on the road had taught me something else besides trusting my instincts. It had taught me that the most beautiful things were often the most dangerous. Black ice that looked like scattered diamonds, fog that rolled in like a soft blanket, but could kill you just as dead as any head-on collision. And apparently fuel pumps that sang hymns in the middle of the night. I bit down hard on my tongue, using the sharp pain to cut through the music's hypnotic influence. The taste of blood in my mouth was harsh and real, an anchor to the physical world that the hymn was trying to pull me away from. With tremendous effort, I forced my hand to move, to replace the fuel nozzle in its cradle. The moment the connection was broken. The thing about driving freight through the Montana Badlands is that you learn to trust your truck more than you trust yourself. After 18 years behind the wheel of my Peterbilt, I know every rattle in her chassis, every whine in her transmission, every flicker in her dashboard light. So when that amber warning light started blinking in patterns I'd never seen before, deep into a moonless October night, I knew something wasn't right. I was hauling a load of agricultural equipment from Billings to Spokane, taking the northern route through some of the loneliest country you'll find in the lower 40. The kind of road where you might not see another vehicle for 50 miles, where the radio fades to static, and even the CB goes quiet. Just you, your rig, and endless stretches of prairie grass that whisper secrets to the wind. The weather had been cooperating until around midnight, when a light drizzle began speckling my windshield. Not enough to slow me down, just enough to make the highway gleam like black glass under my headlight. The rhythmic sweep of the wipers and the steady rumble of the diesel engine had settled me into that meditative state long-haul drivers know well, where miles disappear beneath your wheels and time becomes fluid. It was the engine temperature warning, positioned right in the center of my instrument cluster. Normally, when it illuminates, it stays on solid until whatever problem triggered it gets resolved. But this light was different. It would flash 3 times quickly, pause, then flash 3 more times, pause again, then give 3 longer blinks before going dark for exactly 10 seconds. Then the pattern would repeat. Old trucks develop quirks, and my girl was pushing 300,000 miles. But as the pattern continued, something nagged at the back of my mind. 3 quick, 3 quick, 3 long. I'd heard that rhythm before, somewhere in the dusty corners of memory. My engine temperature gauge was reading normal. Coolant levels were fine, oil pressure steady. Nothing else on the dashboard suggested any kind of problem, just that one amber light, blinking its mysterious message into the darkness of the The realization hit me somewhere past mile marker 65, as I was climbing a long grade through rolling hills, dotted with cattle. 3 short, 3 short, 3 long. SOS, the international distress signal, tapped out in Morse code by a truck that showed no other signs of distress. I keyed the CB radio, scanning through channels, but found only the soft hiss of empty airwaves. Breaker, breaker. This is Freight Dog eastbound, on Highway 2. Anybody out there copy? Nothing but static reply. The isolation of these Montana highways can be absolute, especially in the dead hours before dawn. The light kept flashing its patient message. SOS. 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 Always the same 10-second pause between repetitions, as regular as a heartbeat. I found myself counting along with it, the rhythm becoming hypnotic. 3 quick, 3 quick, 3 long, pause. By mile marker 70, I was starting to feel genuinely unsettled. I'd been driving professionally since I was 22, and I'd never encountered anything like this. Warning lights malfunction, sure, but they don't malfunction into coherent patterns. They don't spell out distress calls in dots and dashes. The rain was picking up, forcing me to increase the wiper speed. The droplets caught my headlight beams and scattered them into prismatic fragments that danced across the asphalt. In the distance, I could make out the dark bulk of the Rocky Mountain foothills, black shapes against a charcoal sky. The dashboard clock read 2:47 a.m. That's when I saw the other truck. It appeared in my mirrors first, headlights emerging from a dip in the highway behind me. Another big rig, by the spread of the lights and the height above the roadway. I felt a small surge of relief. Company on these lonely stretches always made the miles pass easier. The headlights had an odd, flickering quality, and they seemed dimmer than they should be. As it drew closer, I could make out more details in my side mirror. It was an older Kenworth, probably from the 80s, with the classic long nose and rectangular headlight. The kind of truck you don't see much anymore on the highways. You can hear them coming from miles away, the deep rumble of compression ignition and the whine of turbochargers. But this Kenworth approached in complete silence, its headlights growing larger in my mirrors, without any accompanying sound, penetrating the cab of my own rig. The SOS light continued its relentless pattern. 3 quick, 3 quick, 3 long pause. I found myself wondering if somehow the approaching truck was connected to the signal. Maybe its driver was in distress, trying to communicate through the CB or some other electronic means that was interfering with my electrical system. The static seemed to intensify in response, filling the cab with white noise that made my skin crawl. The truck was almost directly behind me now, close enough that its headlights filled my mirrors and cast the interior of my cab in stark relief. I could see my own reflection in the windshield, eyes wide with growing unease. The dashboard lights painted everything in shades of green and amber, except for that one warning light, still blinking its urgent message. I pressed the accelerator, increasing my speed to put some distance between us. The Kenworth matched my acceleration exactly, maintaining the same following distance. When I slowed down, it slowed down. When I changed lanes, it changed lane. Like it was shadowing me, mimicking my every movement. Mile marker 77 flashed past in the darkness, and suddenly the SOS light stopped blinking. The silence in the cab was profound. Without the rhythmic flashing, I realized how much I'd come to depend on that amber pulse. It had become a metronome, marking time in the endless night. Now there was only the steady glow of the normal dashboard lights and the whisper of rain against glass, gone as if it had never been there at all. The highway behind me stretched empty into the darkness, my own taillights reflecting red off the wet asphalt. My hands were trembling on the steering wheel. I tried to convince myself that the truck had simply turned off, while I wasn't watching, maybe taken a ranch road or a rest area. I hadn't noticed, but I knew every mile of this route, every turnoff and intersection. There hadn't been anywhere for it to go. The engine temperature light flickered once, briefly, then came back on solid. This time, it wasn't blinking in patterns. It was a genuine warning. My temperature gauge was climbing into the red zone, and I could see steam beginning to rise from under the hood. I had maybe 5 minutes before the engine would overheat completely, stranding me on this desolate stretch of highway. I coasted to the shoulder and brought the rig to a stop. Hazard lights flashing orange against the rain-slicked darkness. The silence outside was absolute. No wind, no distant traffic, no sound, except the tick of cooling metal and the soft patter of rain on the roof of the cab. I climbed down to check the engine, flashlight in hand. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the massive diesel engine in harsh white light. Everything looked normal. Coolant hoses intact, no visible leaks, belts tight and properly aligned. But the temperature gauge insisted something was wrong. That's when I noticed the mile marker. 77. I was parked directly beside mile marker 77, the exact spot where the SOS signal had stopped. As I stood there in the rain, flashlight beam playing across the engine compartment, I heard something that made my blood freeze, the distant rumble of a diesel engine, growing louder, approaching from the west, the direction I'd been traveling. I looked up to see headlights cresting a hill about a mile away. Old headlights, rectangular and dim, a Kenworth probably from the 80s, with the classic long nose design. My engine temperature gauge slowly returned to normal as I watched the truck approach. By the time it passed my position, everything was reading perfectly normal again. The Kenworth's driver didn't slow down, didn't acknowledge my presence on the shoulder, just rolled past with that odd flickering quality to its light. I climbed back into the cab and fired up the engine. It started immediately, purring like the weight of what we carry. From Marcus, the tailgate on my Chevy Silverado had been acting up for 3 weeks. When I finally decided to do something about it, not mechanical trouble, mind you, the latch worked fine, the hinges were solid, and there wasn't so much as a whisper of rust on the thing. No. The problem was simpler and somehow much worse. It kept slamming shut on its own, always when I wasn't looking, always with that same heavy metallic bang that made my teeth ache and sent shivers crawling up my spine like cold fingers. I'd been driving long haul for 15 years, and in all that time I'd learned to trust my instincts about machinery. Trucks talk to you if you know how to listen, the way an engine coughs before it throws a rod, the particular whine of bearings about to give up the ghost, the subtle pull in the steering wheel that tells you a tire's getting ready to blow. But this tailgate business was different. It felt wrong in a way that had nothing to do with mechanical failure and everything to do with something I couldn't quite name. The first time it happened, I was at a truck stop outside Amarillo, Texas, refueling in the pre-dawn darkness. The air was thick with the smell of diesel and the lingering heat of summer pavement, and the only sounds were the steady hum of my engine cooling down and the distant buzz of fluorescent lights casting their sickly yellow glow across the empty lot. I'd lowered the tailgate to check my cargo. Nothing exciting, just pallets of canned goods bound for a grocery chain in Phoenix. When I heard footsteps behind me, I turned around expecting to see another driver or maybe a lot attendant, but the area was empty. When I looked back at my truck, the tailgate was closed. I stood there for a long moment, listening to the desert wind whistle through the gaps between trailers and wondering if I was more tired than I'd realized. Road fatigue could play tricks on your mind, make you forget things, make you see things that weren't there. I'd been driving for 12 hours straight, and maybe I'd simply closed the tailgate myself without thinking about it. These things happened. Your body went through the motions while your mind wandered elsewhere, following the endless ribbon of highway that stretched ahead. But deep down, I knew that wasn't what had happened. I remembered lowering the tailgate, remembered the solid thunk it made when the chains caught its weight, remembered the way it looked hanging there in the harsh glare of the overhead lights, and I definitely didn't remember closing it. The second incident occurred 3 days later, just outside Little Rock, Arkansas, during one of those summer thunderstorms that turned the world into a wall of water and noise. I'd pulled into a rest area to wait out the worst of it, rain drumming against my windshield with the intensity of machine gun fire while lightning split the sky in jagged white lines that left purple after images dancing behind my eyelids. The storm was too fierce to drive through safely, and I'd learned long ago that patience was a trucker's best friend when Mother Nature decided to throw a tantrum. I was sitting in my cab listening to the radio and watching the storm rage when I noticed movement in my side mirror. The tailgate was down again. I was certain I'd checked it before leaving my last stop, certain it had been properly latched, but there it was, hanging open like a hungry mouth, rain cascading off its edges in silver sheets. The sight of it made something cold settle in my stomach, but I told myself it was just the storm. Lightning could do strange things to metal, create electrical fields that might affect the latch mechanism. It was a stretch, but it was better than the alternatives my imagination was beginning to suggest. I pulled on my rain slicker and climbed out into the storm, immediately soaked despite the protective gear. The rain was cold and sharp, driven by wind that seemed to come from every direction at once. I sloshed through forming puddles to the back of my truck, squinting through the downpour at the open tailgate. Everything looked normal. The latch wasn't damaged. The hinges moved smoothly when I tested them, and there was no sign of tampering. I closed it firmly, making sure the latch engaged with a solid click, then stood there for a moment in the driving rain, water streaming down my face as I stared at the closed tailgate and tried to make sense of what was happening. When I climbed back into the cab, my clothes clinging to me like a second skin, and my boots squelching with every step, I was shivering from more than just the cold. I cranked up the heat and tried to focus on the radio, but my eyes kept drifting to the side mirror, watching for any sign of movement from the back of my truck. The tailgate stayed closed for the remainder of the storm, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. By the time the third incident occurred, I was actively dreading. It happened at a way station in Missouri. Broad daylight with plenty of other trucks around. The kind of situation where you'd expect to feel safe and grounded in normalcy. But when I climbed out to do my routine post-weighing inspection, there was the tailgate hanging open again. This time there was something different about it. The truck felt heavier somehow, as if I was carrying more cargo than when I'd started my trip. Not dramatically heavier, just enough to make the engine work a little harder, enough to change the way the truck handled on curves and hills. I walked around to the back, noting how my footsteps seemed muffled despite the concrete surface beneath my boots, and peered into the cargo area. Everything looked exactly as it should, the same pallets in the same positions, secured with the same tie-downs I'd used since loading. But the feeling of extra weight persisted, and when I reached out to close the tailgate, my hand trembled slightly. The metal was ice cold despite the warm Missouri sun beating down on it, cold enough that it almost burned my palm when I grasped the handle. As I pulled the tailgate up, I could have sworn I heard something like a sigh, soft and barely audible above the sounds of traffic and idling engines. It might have been wind through the truck's undercarriage, or the settling of cargo, or the expansion of metal and the heat, but it sounded disturbingly like a breath being released, like something that had been holding its breath was finally allowing itself to relax. That night, parked at a truck stop in Kansas, with my mandatory rest period stretching ahead of me like a prison sentence, I did something I'd never done before in 15 years of driving. I got out my logbook and started documenting every instance of the tailgate opening on its own. Not in the official log where truck inspectors and company supervisors might see it. I wasn't ready to explain something I didn't understand myself, but in a small notebook I kept for personal notes and observations. The tailgate opened every time I stopped, usually within 10 to 15 minutes of shutting down the engine. It didn't matter if I was at a truck stop, a way station, or just pulled over on the shoulder for a quick break. Day or night, fair weather or foul, the result was always the same. The tailgate would be open when I checked, and the truck would feel incrementally heavier when I started driving again. The thought crept into my mind during the long hypnotic hours of highway driving, growing stronger with each mile that passed beneath my wheels. Maybe someone was using my truck to transport something I wasn't supposed to know about. Maybe there was a hidden compartment I'd never noticed. Or maybe someone had found a way to attach containers to the underside of my trailer. The possibilities were endless and progressively more paranoid, but they gave me something concrete to worry about instead of dwelling on the supernatural implications I was trying not to consider. I started conducting more thorough inspections every time the tailgate opened, running my hands along every surface, checking for hidden panels or unusual attachments. I crawled under the truck with a flashlight, examining the chassis for anything that didn't belong. I measured the cargo area and compared it to the truck specifications. I did everything I could think of to find a rational explanation for what was happening, but my searches always came up empty. The truck was exactly what it appeared to be, a standard freight hauler with nothing unusual about its construction or content. It was in Nebraska, with the endless prairie stretching away on both sides of the interstate like an ocean of grass, that I finally got a glimpse of what might be riding with me. I'd pulled into a rest area, as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded me of cotton candy at a county fair. The air was still and warm, carrying the sweet scent of hay and wildflowers, and the only sounds were the distant hum of traffic and the gentle rustle of wind through the grass. For Marcus, 23 years I'd been hauling freight across this country, and I thought I knew every bridge, every truck stop, every shortcut between here and the Atlantic. But GPS had other plans that October evening, rerouting me around construction through territory that felt both familiar and impossibly strange. My wipers swept methodically back and forth, clearing the glass just long enough for me to catch glimpses of the countryside rolling past. Cornfields stretched endlessly on either side of the narrow highway, their stalks bent low under the weight of accumulated water. The radio crackled with distant voices, truckers sharing weather updates and road conditions, but their conversations felt muffled and far away, as if the storm was swallowing sound itself. I'd been driving for 11 hours straight, pushing the limits of my logbook when I first saw the bridge rising out of the darkness ahead. It wasn't marked on any of my maps, this towering steel structure that seemed to materialize from the fog like something conjured from memory rather than built by human hands. The GPS showed me crossing water here, but it gave no name for the river below, no indication of the bridge's age or specifications, just a thin blue line marking my path across what looked like empty space on the digital display. As I approached the entrance, my headlights illuminated a weathered sign barely visible through the rain. The metal was so corroded that I could only make out fragments of text, something about weight restrictions and a date that might have been. The bridge itself looked older than that, its steel girders dark with rust and age, rivets the size of dinner plates holding together beams that groaned audibly even before I started across. The rain seemed to intensify, hammering against my cab with renewed fury, but there was something else mixed in with the storm sounds now. Voices, faint but unmistakable, carried on the wind that howled through the steel framework. At first I thought it might be my radio picking up some distant broadcast, but when I reached over to adjust the volume, I found it was already turned off. The bridge stretched much longer than it had appeared from the approach. My speedometer showed I was maintaining 50 miles per hour, but the crossing seemed to take forever, as if the structure was extending itself with each passing moment. Through my side windows, I could see the skeletal steel beams flashing past in the glow of my running lights, and beyond them, nothing but darkness where the river should have been. No reflection of my lights on a whir below, no sound of current flowing beneath the spans, just an empty void that seemed to swallow light and sound alike. Not the mechanical hesitation of a fuel problem, or the grinding protest of an overworked transmission, but something more subtle, as if the truck itself was becoming uncertain about moving forward. The steady diesel rumble that had been my constant companion for hundreds of thousands of miles took on an irregular rhythm, almost like breathing, like something alive and afraid. They appeared gradually in my mirrors, faint outlines barely visible through the rain and fog. Old cars with rounded fenders and chrome that caught my taillights. A pickup truck that looked like it belonged in a museum. Another semi, its cab style decades out of date, following at a distance that remained constant no matter how my speed fluctuated. None of them had their lights on, but they moved with purpose, maintaining formation like a convoy from some forgotten era. The voices were getting clearer now, rising and falling with the wind. Conversations in languages I couldn't identify, snippets of what sounded like radio broadcasts from the past, fragments of songs that tugged at memories I didn't know I had. A woman's voice cut through the others, speaking with the careful diction of old newsreels, describing an accident on a bridge during a storm, lives lost when the structure failed under the weight of too many vehicles crossing at once. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as the full implications began to settle in. The bridge was remembering everything that had ever crossed it, every journey that had ended here, every soul that had trusted its steel and concrete to carry them safely across the void. And somehow, impossibly, those memories were becoming real again, manifesting as ghostly traffic sharing the road with my 30-ton rig. The deck beneath my wheels began to vibrate, not with the steady resonance of a properly engineered span, but with something more chaotic, as if the bridge was struggling to support not just my current weight, but the accumulated burden of every crossing it had ever carried. Through the floor of my cab I could feel the steel beams flexing and groaning, stressed beyond their design limits by the presence of vehicles that existed only in the structure's memory. I pressed harder on the accelerator, desperate to reach the far side before whatever was happening here reached some critical threshold. But the bridge seemed to sense my urgency and responded by stretching itself further, adding spans that hadn't been there moments before, extending the crossing into an endless journey through fog and rain, and the accumulated weight of decades. The ghostly convoy was closing in now, vehicles from every era of American automotive history, forming a procession that surrounded my truck on all sides. I could see their occupants through windows clouded with age and condensation, faces that turned toward me with expressions of recognition, as if they had been waiting specifically for my arrival. Some waved, others simply watched, but all of them seemed to be trying to communicate something urgent, something I needed to understand before it was too late. A particularly violent gust of wind struck the bridge, and for a moment the steel framework around me rang like a massive bell, its resonance carrying harmonics that sounded almost like music. In that crystalline tone I finally understood what the voices had been trying to tell me. The bridge didn't just remember the vehicles that had crossed safely, it remembered everything, every breakdown, every accident, every tragedy that had ever occurred on its span. And it was trying to add my journey to its permanent collection, to make me part of its endless memorial of motion and memory. My voice cut through the static as I described my location, my situation, the impossibility of what I was experiencing. Somewhere out there, other drivers would hear my transmission, would mark the coordinates, would remember that Marcus had crossed a bridge that didn't exist and might never make it to the other side. The act of reaching out, of refusing to become just another silent memory, seemed to break whatever hold the bridge had on reality. The ghostly traffic began to fade, their headlights dimming until only the impression of their presence remained. The voices in the wind grew distant again, settling back into the general murmur of the storm. And finally, mercifully, I saw solid ground approaching through my windshield, as the far side of the bridge materialized out of the fog. My wheels touched asphalt again with a jolt that ran through my entire frame, and suddenly I was back on a normal highway, surrounded by the familiar geometry of guardrails and mile markers. The bridge receded in my mirrors, but when I looked back I wasn't entirely sure what I was seeing. Just darkness, storm, and the fading outline of steel that might have been there, might have been memory, might have been something else entirely. But there was nothing, no structure marked at those coordinates, no river large enough to require a span of that size, just empty farmland stretching to the horizon, as if the crossing had never existed at all. But sometimes, late at night when the rain is falling and the fog rolls thick across the interstate, I tune my radio to the emergency frequency and listen. And sometimes, just sometimes, I hear my own voice crackling through the static, broadcasting from a bridge that remembers everything, warning other drivers about a crossing that may or may not be there, adding my own small memory to the endless catalog of journeys that never quite end. The load I was hauling that night reached its destination on schedule, and I filed my logbook without mentioning the bridge. But I kept the coordinates, wrote them down in the margin of my atlas, with a note that future drivers might understand. Some crossings, I learned, are about more than just getting from one side to the other. Some bridges remember everything that has ever passed over them, and sometimes they're not quite ready to let you go. The thing about driving nights on Interstate 80 is that after 23 years behind the wheel, you know every mile marker, every exit, every rest stop, like the back of your weathered hand. The familiar rhythm of my Peterbilt's engine had been my lullaby through countless sleepless hauls, and that particular October evening was no different as I pushed through Nebraska's endless darkness, hauling a load of electronics from Denver to Chicago. The radio crackled with the usual chatter from other drivers, their voices mixing with the steady thrum of 18 wheels eating up asphalt. Light rain began to speckle my windshield around 11:30, and I switched on the wipers, their rhythmic sweep adding another layer to the symphony of the road. My logbook showed I had maybe 2 hours left before I'd need to pull over for my mandatory rest, but my eyes were already starting to feel heavy, that familiar burning sensation creeping in at the edges. That's when I saw the blue sign reflecting in my headlights, clean and official looking against the Nebraska night. Rest area 2 miles. It announced in standard highway font. I frowned, adjusting my reading glasses and leaning forward slightly. In all my years running this route, I couldn't recall a rest area in this particular stretch between Grand Island and Lincoln. The spacing seemed wrong, off by maybe 15 miles from where I remembered the next facilities should be. But fatigue has a way of playing tricks on memory, and I figured maybe they'd built something new during one of my runs through different states. The Department of Transportation was always updating things after all. My CB crackled as another driver announced his position somewhere behind me, his voice fading into static as the rain picked up intensity. As my rig crested a gentle hill, the rest area spread out below me like a small island of comfort. It looked standard enough, a long rectangular parking lot with designated truck spaces, a modest brick building that would house restrooms and vending machines, and those tall security lights that turn night into an artificial twilight. I downshifted and pulled off, my air brakes sighing as I maneuvered into one of the truck spots. 3 other big rigs were already parked, their running lights creating small constellations in the darkness. The rain drummed steadily on my cab's roof as I filled out my logbook, noting the time and location. Something nagged at me as I wrote, but I couldn't quite place what felt wrong. The restroom building was exactly what you'd expect. Fluorescent lights humming behind yellowed plastic covers, that particular institutional smell of industrial disinfectant and dampness. The facilities were clean enough, though everything had a strange, almost unused quality to it, as if the place had been built yesterday but somehow aged decades in the span of hours. Walking back toward my truck, I noticed one of the other drivers standing beside his cab, a cigarette glowing in the darkness. He was an older man with a gray beard, wearing the kind of worn flannel shirt that spoke of years on the road. I nodded as I approached, following the unwritten protocol of truckers acknowledging each other in the small hours. "You just pull in?" he asked, taking a long drag from his cigarette. "Few minutes ago," I replied. "Nice to have a spot to get out of the rain." "I've been parked here since around 9, he said slowly. "Funny thing is, I could swear this rest area wasn't on my GPS when I left Omaha this morning. Just seemed to appear when I needed it most." I felt a small chill that had nothing to do with the October. "You run this route regular?" I asked. "Every week for the past 5 years, he replied. "Know it like my own driveway, but I can't place this stop on my mental map, if you know what I mean. Everything about it seems right, but the location feels all wrong." We stood in comfortable silence for a few moments, listening to the rain and the distant hum of diesel engines idling through the night. Other drivers moved like shadows between the trucks and the building, their forms indistinct in the amber light and falling moisture. There was something dreamlike about the entire scene, as if we were all actors in a play none of us remembered auditioning for. "Well, I better catch some sleep," the older driver finally said, flicking his cigarette into the darkness. "Long haul to Cleveland tomorrow." I climbed back into my cab and settled into the sleeper berth, pulling my logbook out to double-check my entries. That nagging feeling persisted as I traced my route with one finger, calculating miles and time. According to my records and my memory, this rest area shouldn't exist where it was. The next facility should be at least 20 miles further east, just before the approaches to Lincoln. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by the sounds of trucks arriving and departing throughout the night. Each time I drifted off, I seemed to hear conversations drifting through the rain, voices of drivers expressing the same confusion about the location, the same sense that something wasn't quite right about where they'd found refuge from the road. I woke around 4 in the morning to a strange quiet. The rain had stopped, and even the ever-present hum of idling engines seemed muted. Through my windshield, I could see that the other trucks were still there, but the rest area felt different somehow, as if the very air had changed while I slept. The security lights seemed dimmer, their amber glow less warm and inviting than it had been hours earlier. Stepping out of the cab, I immediately noticed that the pavement beneath my boots looked older, more cracked and weathered than it had the night before. The restroom building, too, seemed somehow more worn, its brick facade showing signs of age and neglect that definitely hadn't been visible in the darkness. But most unsettling of all was the sign by the entrance to the facility, the same blue highway sign I'd seen from the interstate, except now it read, "Rest area closed. No services available." The other drivers were stirring, and I could hear similar expressions of confusion and concern from the direction of the other trucks. The older man with the gray beard approached me, his face drawn with worry and fatigue. "You see that sign?" he asked, pointing toward the entrance. I nodded, unable to find words for what I was experiencing. The whole rest area felt like a movie set being struck, losing its reality as daylight crept across the Nebraska landscape. "GPS says we're not where we should be," another driver called out, holding up his device. "According to this, we're sitting in the middle of an empty field about 40 miles west of where I thought we stopped." As the sun climbed higher, dispelling the last shadows of night, the rest area began to feel increasingly insubstantial, as if it were slowly dissolving around us. The building looked abandoned, windows dark and doors that appeared to be locked or boarded up. The parking lot showed cracks and weeds that seemed to grow more pronounced with each passing minute. One by one, we fired up our engines and pulled back onto the interstate, each of us desperate to return to the familiar rhythm of the road and leave behind whatever strange pocket of unreality we'd stumbled into. My CB radio crackled with nervous chatter as we tried to make sense of what we'd experienced, but no explanation seemed adequate. Miles later, as I passed the official rest area that I recognized from countless previous runs, I checked my mirrors and saw the other trucks scattered across the highway behind me, each driver probably questioning his own memory and wondering if fatigue had played tricks on his perception. But late at night, when I'm working the same stretch of Interstate 80, I sometimes catch glimpses of amber lights in my peripheral vision, and I hear other drivers on the CB mentioning a rest area that appears when you need it most, but can never be found on any map. They say it moves along the highway, offering comfort to tired drivers before vanishing with the dawn, leaving only questions and the persistent feeling that the road holds secrets we're not meant to understand. I've never stopped there again, but sometimes when the rain falls steady and my eyes burn with fatigue, I see that blue sign reflecting in my headlights, and I wonder what would happen if I took that exit one more time. The thing about driving the overnight shift is that you start to recognize the regulars, not just the other truckers at the fuel stops, but the workers too. The gas station attendants pulling their graveyard shifts, the road crews fixing potholes by floodlight, and especially the flagger. You see them standing out there in their bright orange safety vests, reflective tape catching your headlights like scattered stars, and after enough trips along the same routes, their faces become as familiar as the mile marker. That's why I noticed her right away on that foggy October night somewhere between Bakersfield and Fresno. Interstate 5 was down to one lane for construction, the kind of endless California roadwork that seems to stretch for miles without any actual workers in sight. My Peterbilt's engine hummed its familiar diesel lullaby as I approached the flagger station, expecting to see Dale, the weathered guy in his 60s, who'd been working this stretch for months. Instead, there was this woman I'd never seen before. She stood perfectly still beside the portable traffic light, her orange safety vest pristine and bright against the swirling mist. Even from a distance, something seemed off about her posture, too rigid, too motionless, like a mannequin someone had dressed up and positioned by the roads. As I got closer, slowing my rig to match the pace of traffic ahead, I could see her face in the wash of my headlights, pale, almost luminous in the fog, with dark eyes that seemed to track my approach with an intensity that made the hair on my neck prickle. The weird thing was how clean she looked. Every flagger I'd ever seen was covered in road dust, their vests grimy from hours of standing next to diesel exhaust and kicked up asphalt. But this woman's vest practically glowed with newness, and her dark hair was perfectly neat, not a strand out of place despite the damp wind that was making my truck shudder slightly in its lane. It's just courtesy acknowledging the folks who keep us safe out there. But she didn't wave back, didn't even nod. She just stood there, turning slightly to keep watching my truck as it moved past her position. In my side mirror I could see her orange vest glowing in my taillights, and I swear she was still facing my direction long after I should have been out of her line of sight. The construction zone seemed to go on forever that night, which was strange because I'd driven this route the week before and the work area had been maybe 2 miles long. Now it felt like I was crawling along at 15 miles per hour for at least double that distance, my CB radio crackling with complaints from other drivers about the delay. The fog had thickened too, reducing visibility to maybe 50 feet in either direction, turning the familiar highway into something alien and uncertain. When I finally reached the end of the construction zone, there was another flagger station. And there she was again, the same woman in the same impossibly clean orange vest, standing with that same unnatural stillness. My rational mind tried to process this, figuring maybe she'd been moved to the other end of the work zone for some reason, or maybe it was just someone who looked similar. But as I passed her for the second time, I got a clear look at her face in my headlights, and there was no mistaking those dark eyes or that pale, almost translucent skin. This time, she did move, not to wave or acknowledge the passing traffic, but to step slightly closer to the road, close enough that I could see her lips moving, though no sound reached me through my closed windows and the steady rumble of my engine. She seemed to be saying something, urgently, repeatedly, but the fog swallowed whatever words she might have been speaking. I should have kept driving, should have focused on the road ahead and chalked it up to a long night and too much coffee. But something about her expression, the way her mouth moved in what looked like a warning, made me tap my brakes and lean toward my passenger window. She was pointing now not at my truck but at something behind me, and when I checked my mirrors the fog had closed in so thick that I couldn't see anything at all. No other vehicles, no lights, nothing but gray emptiness pressing against my trailer. The radio crackled to life with a voice I didn't recognize, scratchy and distorted through the static. Northbound traffic. Be advised, road conditions deteriorating rapidly. Multiple vehicle incident reported ahead. Proceed with extreme caution. I reached for the CB handset to respond, to ask for clarification, but the voice cut out, leaving only white noise and the occasional distant chatter from truckers who sounded impossibly far away. When I looked back toward where the woman had been standing, she was gone. The portable traffic light was still there, cycling through its colors in the fog, but the flagger station was empty. No sign that anyone had ever been there, except for the vivid memory of those dark eyes and moving lips, trying to warn me of something I couldn't understand. I picked up speed once I was clear of the construction zone, eager to put some distance between myself and whatever strangeness had settled over that stretch of highway. But the fog seemed to follow me, thick tendrils creeping across the road like reaching fingers. My headlights barely penetrated the murk, and I found myself leaning forward in my seat, straining to see beyond the white wall that had descended around my truck. Standing on the shoulder about a quarter-mile ahead, her orange vest blazing like a beacon in the mist. This time, there was no construction zone, no reason for a flagger to be positioned there in the middle of nowhere. Just her solitary figure beside the dark highway, perfectly still except for that urgent movement of her lips. Close enough that I could see her face clearly as I passed, could read the word her lips were forming over and over again. Stop, stop, stop. But I didn't stop, couldn't stop, not on a highway in fog this thick. Instead I kept my rig moving at a steady pace, watching her in my mirrors until she vanished again into the gray nothing. My hands were shaking slightly on the steering wheel, and I realized I was holding my breath, expecting something terrible to emerge from the fog at any moment. The next few miles passed in eerie silence. Even my CB had gone quiet. No chatter from other drivers, no distant voices to remind me I wasn't alone out there. Just the steady hum of my engine and the whisper of fog against my windshield. I started to relax, started to convince myself that the stress of too many overnight runs was finally catching up with me, making me see things that weren't there. She was standing in the middle of the road now, directly in my path, both hands raised as if to physically stop my 18-wheeler. There was nowhere to swerve, not in this fog. Not at this speed. I had maybe 3 seconds to decide whether to trust my brakes on the damp asphalt, or plow straight through what might have been a hallucination. I chose to brake, standing on the pedal and feeling my trailer start to slide slightly on the wet road. The woman in the orange vest grew larger in my windshield, her pale face turned upward toward my cab, her mouth moving frantically. And just as my truck shuddered to a stop, maybe 10 feet from where she stood, she pointed over my hood and vanished. Not moved away, not stepped aside, vanished, like fog dispersing in sunlight. But before I could process what I'd seen, my headlights illuminated what lay ahead. A massive sinkhole had opened across both lanes of the highway, a black pit that disappeared into darkness beyond the reach of my light. If I hadn't stopped, if the woman hadn't forced me to brake, my truck would have plunged straight into that void. I sat there for a long moment, engine idling, hands trembling on the wheel, staring at the gap in the road that would have swallowed me whole. When I finally reached for my CB to report the hazard, the radio crackled back to life with normal chatter. Truckers discussing weather and routes and delivery schedule. The fog began to lift, revealing clear pavement behind me and the bright lights of emergency vehicles approaching in the distance. Crews coming to deal with the sinkhole that must have opened just minutes before. I never saw the woman in the orange vest again, though I still drive that stretch of I-5 regularly. Sometimes, late at night when the fog rolls in, I find myself watching for her in my mirrors, wondering who she was and why she chose to save me. The official report blamed the sinkhole on recent heavy rains and unstable soil, but I know better. I know that somewhere out there, the mile marker that never moves. Never Kowalski. I've been running freight across the Midwest for 23 years, and in all that time, I thought I'd seen every truck stop worth knowing, between Chicago and Denver. The good ones with hot coffee and clean restrooms, the sketchy ones where you keep your doors locked, and everything in between. But I'd never seen the Crossroads Travel Plaza until that foggy October night when my fuel gauge was kissing empty and my eyelids felt like they were made of lead. The place materialized out of the mist like something from an old movie, all chrome and neon against the darkness. The sign was one of those vintage numbers, the kind they don't make anymore, with letters that glowed soft amber in the night. It looked welcoming enough, sitting there at what my GPS insisted was mile marker 24/7 on Interstate 80, though I could have sworn I'd passed that same marker about an hour back. The fog was playing tricks on my eyes, making everything seem doubled and strange. My Peterbilt's engine gave that distinctive rumble it makes when it's thirsty, and I guided her into the lot with the practiced ease of 2 decades behind the wheel. The place was busy for this time of night, maybe a dozen rigs parked in neat rows under the sodium light. Their chrome bumpers caught the glow like sleeping giants, and I could hear the low hum of auxiliary power units, keeping cabs comfortable for drivers catching their mandatory rest. The fuel pumps were the old-fashioned kind, with mechanical dials that spun with satisfying clicks as the diesel flowed. I watched the numbers tumble past, noting how slowly they seemed to move, each gallon taking what felt like minutes to register. The fog swirled around the lot in lazy spirals, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear the faint sound of jazz music drifting from the diner attached to the main building. Inside, the place had that timeless quality that the best truck stops possess, all worn linoleum, and red vinyl booth seats that had seen countless drivers come and go. The coffee smelled rich and strong, and the pie case displayed perfect wedges of apple and cherry under warm yellow light. Behind the counter, a woman with silver hair and kind eyes smiled at me with the practiced patience of someone who'd been serving truckers since before I was born. She mentioned something about the fog being particularly thick tonight, how it seemed to settle in the low places and stay there, making time feel different somehow. I nodded and agreed, though I wasn't quite sure what she meant by that last part. The coffee was exactly what I needed, hot and black with just enough bite to chase away the drowsiness that had been creeping up on me. I settled into a booth by the window and watched other drivers moving through their routines, checking tire pressure, securing load straps, all the little rituals that keep us safe on the road. The jazz music continued its lazy melody, something with a saxophone that seemed to stretch each note longer than it should go. It felt like I'd been sitting there for at least half an hour, maybe more. The fog outside seemed thicker now, pressing against the windows like something alive and curious. I could barely make out the shapes of the other trucks, their running lights creating small halos of red and amber in the mist. In the narrow hallway leading to the facilities, I passed a man in a flannel shirt and ball cap who looked familiar. Not personally familiar, but familiar in the way that truckers often do, like I'd seen him at other stops along this route. He was studying a road atlas spread across a small table, tracing routes with his finger in slow, methodical movement. What struck me as strange was how long his finger stayed on each highway line, as if he was having trouble processing the information or making a decision that should have been simple. I nodded as I passed, and he looked up with a confused expression, like he wasn't quite sure where he was or what he'd been doing. Back in the main dining area, I ordered a piece of that apple pie, partly because it looked delicious, and partly because I wasn't quite ready to face the fog again. The waitress, the same silver-haired woman from the counter, moved with deliberate slowness, each step measured and careful. She set the plate before me with the kind of gentle precision usually reserved for handling something fragile. The pie was perfect, the kind of homemade quality you rarely find at chain stops. Each bite seemed to last forever, the flavors developing and changing as I chewed. The apples were tender and sweet, the crust flaky and golden, and somehow each forkful felt more satisfying than the last. I found myself eating more slowly than usual, savoring each taste as if I might never have pie this good again. Other drivers continued their quiet conversations at nearby tables, but their words seemed to stretch and blur together, creating a low murmur that blended with the jazz music still playing from hidden speakers. I caught fragments of familiar road talk, discussions of delivery schedules and weather reports, but everything sounded somehow distant and unhurried, as if urgency itself had been left outside in the fog. According to the digital display, exactly 10 minutes had passed since I'd last checked the time. Not 15 or 20 minutes as I would have expected after ordering and eating the pie, but exactly 10. I stared at the numbers waiting for them to change, and when they finally did, the transition seemed to take much longer than a normal second. I glanced around the diner with new attention, studying the other drivers more carefully. The man with the road atlas was still in the hallway, still tracing the same route with his finger, still wearing that confused expression. A woman at the counter was stirring cream into her coffee with the same slow, clockwise motion, around and around without ever taking a sip. Near the magazine rack, another driver was flipping through a trucking publication, but his eyes weren't tracking the pages, just staring ahead with blank concentration. The realization crept over me like the fog outside, slow and encompassing. Something was wrong with time in this place. Not stopped exactly, but stretched thin, like taffy being pulled. I could feel my own movements beginning to slow, my thoughts becoming languid and dreamy. The warmth of the diner, the soft music, the gentle lighting, all of it was designed to make me want to stay, to rest, to let time wash over me like a warm bath. The silver-haired waitress looked at me with those kind eyes, and I saw something else there now, something hungry and patient. She smiled and suggested I might want to try their famous coconut cream pie, or perhaps another cup of their special coffee blend. Her voice was soothing and reasonable, and part of me wanted nothing more than to sit back down and accept her offer. Instead, I pulled out my wallet and left money on the table, more than enough to cover the coffee and pie. My hands felt heavy, like I was moving through thick liquid, and each step toward the door required conscious effort. The other drivers watched me go with expressions of mild curiosity, but none of them moved to follow. They seemed content to remain in their various poses, caught in whatever small action they'd been performing when time decided to slow down around them. Outside, the fog had grown so thick that I could barely see my own truck, even though I'd parked it only 50 yards from the entrance. My boots echoed strangely on the asphalt, each footfall taking longer to fade than it should. The air felt heavy and damp against my skin, carrying scents of diesel fuel and something else, something organic and old, like mushrooms growing in a dark place. I climbed into my cab and started the engine, grateful for the familiar rumble and vibration that seemed to anchor me to the real world. The dashboard clock showed the same time as my watch, confirming that at least my own timepieces were still functioning normally. I engaged the transmission and began rolling toward what I hoped was the exit, following the dim glow of my headlights through the impenetrable mist. I kept my speed low and steady, trusting my sense of direction and the occasional glimpse of painted lines on the pavement. Behind me, the glow of the truck stop's neon sign grew fainter and fainter until it disappeared entirely, swallowed by the rolling gray wall that surrounded everything. When I finally emerged from the fog bank about 10 minutes later, the change was dramatic and immediate. One moment I was crawling through thick soup, and the next I was driving under a clear, star-filled sky. I pulled over at the first rest area I found and checked my log, the voice behind the static. From Jake Morrison, the CB radio crackled to life at exactly 11:47 p.m., just as I was settling into that familiar highway rhythm that comes with driving the same route for 15 years. Interstate 80 stretched endlessly ahead of me through the Nevada desert, my headlights carving a narrow tunnel through the darkness, while the steady hum of my Peterbilt's engine provided the only soundtrack to another lonely night haul. I'd been running freight between Sacramento and Denver for so long that every truck stop, every overpass, every mile marker had become as familiar as the creases in my own weathered hand. The voice that emerged from the static was smooth and professional, exactly what you'd expect from dispatch at this hour. Unit 779, this is base. Come in, Jake. I recognized the cadence immediately, or at least I thought I did. It sounded like Carol from dispatch, the woman who'd been coordinating routes and check-ins for our small freight company since before I'd even started driving. Her voice had guided me through countless midnight runs, always calm and reassuring despite the late hour. I reached for the handset, grateful for the human connection that broke through the desert's overwhelming silence. This is 779, go ahead base. The response came immediately, that same familiar tone, washing over me like warm coffee on a cold morning. Jake, we've got a route change for you. Need you to take exit 28-4 and head north on Route 4. New pickup in Gerlach. High priority. Something about the instruction felt routine yet slightly off, like a song played in a different key, but I couldn't quite place what was bothering me. I checked my GPS and frowned. Route 447 would take me deep into the Black Rock Desert, a desolate stretch of alkali flats, where cell service disappeared, and the nearest town was more like a collection of weathered buildings than an actual community. Base, that's pretty far off my usual route. What's the pickup? The response came without hesitation. Medical supplies, Jake. Time sensitive. Companies paying double rate for the detour. The mention of medical supplies and double pay made sense of the unusual request, and I found myself already signaling toward the upcoming exit. As I turned onto the smaller highway, the landscape around me seemed to shift from merely empty to actively hostile. The scrub brush looked skeletal in my headlights, and the mountains in the distance formed jagged silhouettes against the star-filled sky. My CB remained quiet for nearly an hour as I drove deeper into the desert, the only sounds being the whistle of wind around my cab and the occasional ping of gravel against my windshield. When the radio finally crackled back to life, I felt a wave of relief at hearing that familiar voice again. Unit 779, how's your progress? The question seemed normal enough, but there was something about the inflection that made me pause. Carol had always been professional, but there had always been a warmth in her voice, a maternal quality that made even the grumpiest drivers feel looked after. This voice had the same words, the same basic tone, but it felt somehow hollow, like an echo of the person I knew. Making good time, base. Should reach Gerlach in about 20 minutes. The response came immediately. Excellent, Jake. You're such a good driver. So reliable. So predictable. The last word hung in the air like a discordant note, and I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the desert night. Carol had never talked like that, had never used that particular phrasing. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself that late-night shifts could make anyone sound different, but the feeling persisted like a splinter in my mind. The miles rolled by in increasing silence, broken only by the occasional check-in from dispatch, each exchange feeling more stilted and wrong than the last. When I finally saw the lights of Gerlach ahead, such as they were, I felt a mixture of relief and growing apprehension. The town looked exactly as desolate as I'd expected. A handful of buildings scattered along the highway like dice thrown carelessly across felt. My CB crackled again. "Jake, proceed to the old gas station on the north end of town. Your contact will be waiting." I could see the station ahead, its broken neon sign casting sickly pink light across the cracked asphalt, but there were no other vehicles in sight, no signs of life at all. The silence stretched uncomfortably until my radio came to life again. "Jake, please step out of your vehicle and check your trailer connections. We're showing some irregularities in your cargo monitoring system." The request seemed reasonable enough. Routine trailer maintenance that every driver performed multiple times during a long haul. But something about being asked to leave my cab in this isolated place made every instinct I'd developed in 15 years of trucking scream in protest. "Base, I checked everything at my last fuel stop. All connections are secure." The voice that responded carried a subtle but unmistakable edge of irritation. "Jake, please comply with dispatch instructions. Step out and check your connections now." There was something in that tone that reminded me less of Carol's patient professionalism and more of a parent scolding a disobedient child, and it made my skin crawl. I found myself gripping the handset tighter as a terrible realization began to creep through my mind. I reached for my cell phone, knowing I probably wouldn't have service but needing to try anyway. The screen showed no bars, as expected, but it also showed the time, 2:38. According to my logbook, I'd been driving for over 4 hours since that first radio call, but my fuel gauge showed I'd barely used a quarter tank. The numbers didn't add up, and neither did the growing certainty that something was fundamentally wrong with this entire situation. The radio crackled again, and this time I listened with the kind of focused attention that comes from genuine fear. "Jake, we know you're having concerns. There's no need to be afraid. Just step out of the truck." The voice was still recognizably Carol's, but there were subtle differences that I'd been trying to ignore. The breathing seemed wrong, too regular, like someone consciously remembering to breathe rather than doing it naturally. The pronunciation was slightly off, as if the speaker was carefully forming each word rather than letting them flow in natural speech pattern. The engine roared to life with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the desert silence, and I threw the truck into gear without bothering to check my mirrors. Behind me I could hear the CB crackling with increasingly frantic calls. "Jake, return to the station immediately. Jake, you are in violation of company policy. Jake, you cannot leave." As I accelerated back toward the main highway, I caught a glimpse of something in my side mirror that made my blood freeze. Standing in the glow of that broken neon sign was a figure that seemed to shift and waver like heat mirages, never quite solid enough to make out clearly. It raised what might have been an arm in a gesture that could have been a wave goodbye or a threat, and for just a moment, I could have sworn I heard Carol's voice coming not from the radio but from somewhere much closer. Somewhere inside my own cab. I drove through the night in complete radio silence, not daring to touch the CB until I reached the familiar glow of Reno's lights on the horizon. When I finally worked up the courage to call into actual dispatch, Carol's real voice answered immediately, warm and concerned when I explained I'd had to abort the Gerlach pickup due to mechanical issues. She had no record of any route change, no knowledge of medical supplies or double pay, and when I described the location where I'd been directed, she went quiet for a long moment, before telling me that the old gas station in Gerlach had been abandoned for over a decade. I never found out who or what had been speaking to me through that radio, mimicking Carol's voice with such careful precision. Company records showed no outgoing communications to my unit during the time frame in question, and my GPS tracking showed I'd somehow driven nearly 200 miles through the desert, while officially remaining on interstate. The fuel I should have used was gone. The wear on my tires was real, but according to every official record, I'd never left my scheduled route at all. These days I still run the same freight routes, And Carol still dispatches our runs with the same professional warmth she's always shown. But sometimes, late at night when I'm driving through empty stretches of highway, my CB will crackle to life with voices that sound almost but not quite like the people I know, offering route changes and special assignments that would take me far from traveled roads. I've learned to recognize the subtle differences, the too perfect pronunciation, the breathing that sounds like an imitation of life rather than life itself. The coffee started defying gravity at exactly 11:43 on a Tuesday night, somewhere between mile marker 387 and the abandoned way station that hadn't seen an inspector in over a decade. I know the precise time because I was watching my dashboard clock, counting down the minutes until my mandatory rest break, when the dark liquid from my thermos cap began climbing upward like it was following some invisible string toward my truck ceiling. I've been driving these highways for 22 years, hauling everything from refrigerated produce to heavy machinery across the continental United States. And in all that time I thought I'd seen every strange phenomenon the road could offer. Desert mirages that looked like crystal lakes, fog so thick it seemed to have weight and substance, ice storms that turned asphalt into mirrors reflecting a sky you couldn't see. But nothing had prepared me for the sight of Colombian dark roast, flowing upward in perfect defiance of every natural law I'd ever understood. It didn't scatter or splash as spilled coffee should. Instead, it maintained its liquid cohesion while streaming upward in thin rivulets that reminded me uncomfortably of veins carrying blood through some massive, invisible body. The sight was so mesmerizing that I nearly missed the exit for State Road 49, the narrow two-lane highway that would take me through the heart of the Cascade foothills toward my delivery in Bend. My CB radio had been crackling with static for the past hour, occasionally picking up fragments of conversations from other drivers who seemed to be discussing unusual weather patterns and road conditions that didn't match anything I was experiencing. The night was clear and cold, with stars visible through my windshield like scattered diamonds against black velvet, but the voices on the radio spoke of fog and rain and visibility so poor they were pulling over to wait for dawn. When I tried to respond, to ask for clarification about their location and conditions, my transmissions seemed to vanish into the electronic void without acknowledgement. The coffee continued its upward journey, now forming delicate tendrils that swayed gently in the air conditioning current from my cab's ventilation system. I reached out tentatively to touch one of the streams, and the liquid was warm against my fingertips, exactly the temperature it should have been if it were sitting normally in my cup. But when I tried to redirect its flow, to guide it back down toward its proper place, it simply passed through my fingers like I was trying to grasp smoke, yet I could still feel its wet warmth against my skin. That's when I noticed the truck stop appearing in my headlights, a collection of buildings that definitely hadn't been marked on my GPS or any of the route maps I'd studied before beginning this run. The main structure was a classic roadside diner from the 1950s, complete with chrome trim and neon signage, though several of the fluorescent tubes in the signs were flickering in patterns that seemed almost rhythmic, like a slow heartbeat made visible in electric blue and pink light. A smaller building beside it housed what appeared to be a convenience store, its windows glowing with the warm yellow light that usually indicated 24-hour operation. 3 other trucks were parked in the lot, their running lights creating small constellations in the darkness, but I couldn't see any movement around the vehicles or any signs of their driver. The absence of human activity struck me as odd for a truck stop at this time of night, when drivers typically gathered to share coffee, trade road stories, and complain about dispatch schedules and fuel prices. Even more strange was the way the coffee in my cab began moving more rapidly the closer I got to the buildings, as if it were responding to some kind of magnetic pull or atmospheric pressure change that I couldn't detect. I pulled into the lot and parked beside a red Peterbilt with Montana plates, its engine ticking softly as it cooled in the night air. The coffee was now flowing in multiple streams from various surfaces throughout my cab, not just from the spilled drops in my thermos cap, but from coffee stains on my console, from the ring marks on my clipboard, even from what looked like coffee-colored residue I hadn't noticed before on my steering wheel and gear shift. All of it moving upward in those same deliberate vein-like patterns that disappeared somewhere near my ceiling, as if passing through the metal into some space that shouldn't exist. The diner's front door was propped open with a rubber wedge, and warm air carrying the rich scent of fresh coffee drifted across the parking lot toward my truck. The aroma was intoxicating, deeper and more complex than any coffee I'd ever encountered, with notes that reminded me of dark chocolate and wooden barrels, and something else I couldn't identify, something that made my mouth water and my pulse quicken simultaneously. Through the diner's windows, I could see the soft glow of overhead lights, and what appeared to be a figure moving behind the counter, though the angle and distance made it impossible to determine any details about the person's appearance or action. I grabbed my jacket and climbed down from my cab, intending to investigate the truck stop and perhaps get some fresh coffee to replace what was apparently defying gravity in my vehicle. But as my feet touched the asphalt, I heard a sound that made me freeze in place. It was a low humming, barely audible beneath the ambient noise of idling engines and highway traffic in the distance, but it seemed to be coming from directly above my head. When I looked up, I saw something that made my rational mind struggle to process what my eyes were reporting. Coffee was falling upward from all three of the other trucks parked in the lot, streaming from their cabs in the same impossible anti-gravity flow I'd been witnessing in my own vehicle. But these streams were thicker, more substantial, and they were converging at a point approximately 30 feet above the parking lot, where they formed a slowly rotating sphere of dark liquid that appeared to be growing larger as more coffee joined its mass. The sphere wasn't perfectly round, but rather seemed to pulse and shift like a living thing, and its surface reflected the neon lights from the diner signs in patterns that moved independently of the light sources themselves. The humming sound grew more distinct as I watched, resolving into what might have been voices, though if they were human voices they were speaking in harmonies and frequencies that human vocal cords shouldn't have been able to produce. The sound seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath my feet and up through my body, causing a strange resonance in my chest cavity that felt almost like being inside a massive bell when it struck. My coffee thermos, still sitting on my dashboard, began to vibrate in sympathy with the humming, creating a higher-pitched harmonic that wove through the deeper tones like a melody line played on glass instrument. I approached the diner with increasing caution, noting that the figure I'd glimpsed through the windows was no longer visible, though the lights remained on and the coffee scent continued to pour from the open doorway. The interior looked perfectly normal from what I could see, with red vinyl booths, a long counter with chrome stools, and the standard truck stop assortment of pie cases and coffee urns. But something about the perspective seemed wrong, as if the space inside was somehow larger than the building's exterior dimensions should have allowed, with the back wall appearing much farther away than the building's depth could accommodate. As I reached for the door handle, my hand passed through several ascending streams of coffee that were flowing upward from inside the diner, joining the growing sphere above the parking lot. The liquid felt warm and thick against my skin, and where it touched me, I experienced a sudden rush of sensations that weren't my own. Flashes of other drivers, other trucks, other nights on roads that looked familiar but weren't quite right, as if I were seeing memories that belonged to someone else or glimpsing alternate versions of journeys I'd taken before. The sphere above the parking lot had grown to roughly the size of a small car, and its rotation was becoming more rapid, creating a vortex effect that was beginning to pull at the air around it. I felt a subtle upward tug on my jacket and hair, as if the sphere's gravitational influence was extending beyond just coffee to include anything in its vicinity. The other trucks were beginning to rock slightly on their springs, and I could hear their CB radios crackling to life simultaneously, broadcasting the same fragmented conversations about weather and road conditions that I'd been hearing for the past hour. That's when I realized the voices on the radio weren't coming from other drivers on the highway. They were coming from the sphere above me, and they were the voices of drivers who had stopped at this truck stop before me. Drivers whose coffee had been drawn upward to join that rotating mass of liquid that was beginning to look less like coffee and more like something alive, something that had been collecting essences and experiences from every trucker who had passed this way. I backed toward my truck, fighting against the increasing upward pull that was making each step feel like walking through thick mud. The coffee streams from my cab were flowing faster now, and I could see that my thermos was completely empty, its contents having joined the aerial phenomenon along with every trace of coffee that had ever existed in my... The thing about driving the same route for 15 years is that you start to know every curve, every pothole, every faded mile marker like they're part of your own body. Interstate 47 through the Nevada desert had been my lifeline since I started hauling freight, a straight shot of asphalt that cut through nothing but sagebrush and starlight. My Peterbilt 389 knew this road as well as I did, her chrome bumpers reflecting the same constellations night after night, her diesel engine humming the same steady rhythm across the vast emptiness between Reno and Las Vegas. But that night in early October, with a load of electronics bound for California and a deadline that had me pushing through instead of stopping at the usual truck stop, the road began to feel different under my 18 wheels. The change started subtly, the way most unsettling things do. At first I thought it was just fatigue playing tricks with my depth perception. The white lines seemed to shimmer more than usual in my headlights, wavering like heat mirages even though the desert air carried the crisp bite of autumn. The CB radio crackled with the usual chatter from other drivers, their voices a comforting backdrop of call signs and weather reports. Breaker 19, this is Moondog westbound on 47. Anybody got eyes on that construction zone past mile marker? The voice was familiar, probably Jake Morrison in his red Kenworth, but when I keyed the mic to respond only static answered back. I tried again adjusting the squelch, but the radio had gone completely silent as if every other truck on the highway had simply vanished. That's when I noticed the road itself was wrong. The curve ahead, a gentle bend to the right that I'd taken thousands of times, wasn't where it should be. Instead of appearing gradually as my headlights swept across the familiar geography, it seemed to materialize suddenly, the white lines curving away into darkness at an angle that made my inner ear protest. I downshifted, air brakes hissing softly, and took the turn slower than usual. But something felt fundamentally off about the physics of it all. The speedometer showed 55, same as always, but the sensation of movement felt thick and strange, like driving through invisible syrup. The engine's vibration, normally a reassuring constant that I felt in my bones, had taken on an odd quality, deeper and more resonant, as if the sound was echoing back from somewhere far below the asphalt. Even the familiar creak of the cab's suspension seemed muffled, absorbed by an atmosphere that had grown unexpectedly dense. I checked my GPS, but the screen showed only a blue dot floating in gray space. No roads, no landmarks, just that lonely indicator pulsing against an empty background. The radio continued its dead silence, not even the white noise of distant stations bleeding through. Outside my windows, the desert landscape rolled by, but the sagebrush and Joshua trees seemed somehow more uniform than I remembered, repeating in patterns that suggested vast wallpaper rather than natural growth. The next curve came too soon, another right turn that appeared without warning in my headlight beams. This one was sharper, forcing me to brake harder, the trailer's weight shifting behind me with a low groan of settling cargo. As I navigated the bend, I caught a glimpse in my side mirror of the road I'd just traveled, but instead of the straight stretch I expected, I saw another curve, this one bending left, as if the highway was rearranging itself in my way. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, knuckles pale in the green glow of the dashboard light. 32 years of driving, from local deliveries in my father's pickup to cross-country hauls in my own rig, and I'd never experienced anything that challenged my basic understanding of how roads work. They're fixed things, carved into the earth and marked with paint, following the contours of the landscape according to engineering principles and geographical necessity. They don't reshape themselves while you're driving on them. But as the next hour passed, that's exactly what seemed to be happening. Each curve led to another curve, always requiring my attention, always forcing me to adjust speed and steering, creating a continuous serpentine path through what should have been arrow-straight desert. The mile markers, when I could catch them in my headlights, seemed to be counting backward now, numbers decreasing instead of climbing toward my destination. 78, 76, 74, as if the road was feeding me back toward where I'd started. The fuel gauge hadn't moved, another impossibility that I tried not to think about too hard. I'd been driving for 3 hours since my last stop, should have burned through at least 50 gallons, but the needle held steady at 3/4 full. The truck's clock had stopped as well, frozen at 2:17 a.m., though my phone showed the same time, the digits unchanging no matter how long I stared at them. I tried to convince myself it was microsleep, those brief moments of unconsciousness that can make time skip and memories blur, but I felt fully awake, hyper-aware of every sound and sensation. The coffee in my travel mug had gone cold, but it tasted exactly the same as it had hours ago, as if time wasn't passing for anything inside the cab. The air freshener hanging from my rearview mirror, a pine tree that should have been scentless after weeks of use, suddenly carried the sharp smell of living forest, incongruous in the desert setting. Headlights, but wrong somehow, too wide-spaced and too bright, casting my trailer in harsh white relief against the darkness. Another truck, I thought with relief, proof that I wasn't completely alone on this increasingly surreal highway. But as the lights grew closer, I realized they weren't following the curves of the road. They moved in a straight line, passing through the landscape as if the bends and turns that constrained my movement simply didn't exist for them. I watched in my side mirror as the lights approached, expecting to see them swing out into the left lane to pass, but they never deviated from their path directly behind me. The illumination grew stronger, so bright that I had to adjust my mirrors to avoid being blinded, but I could never make out the vehicle casting the light, just those twin suns burning in the darkness, maintaining a constant distance no matter how I varied my speed. The road curved left, then right, then left again in increasingly sharp angles, forcing me to gear down until I was crawling along at barely 30 miles per hour. But the lights behind me never faltered, never swung wide on the turns or fell back when I slowed down. They hung there in my mirrors like artificial stars, patient and inexorable, following a path that had nothing to do with the serpentine highway I was trapped on. The road wasn't bending around some obstacle or geological formation. It was bending around me, continuously curving to keep me contained, to prevent me from reaching any destination beyond this endless series of turns. I was driving through a maze that rebuilt itself with each movement, a highway that had somehow developed the ability to think, to adapt, to respond to my presence with malevolent intelligence. The thought should have been impossible to accept, but something deep in my hind brain recognized the truth of it. This was predation, but not by any creature I could understand. The road itself had become a trap, and I was the prey, kept moving by the illusion of progress, while never actually escaping the confines of something vast and hungry. I pressed the accelerator harder, pushing the truck up to dangerous speeds for such tight curves, but the road simply adjusted, the turns becoming more gradual to accommodate my velocity, while somehow remaining just as confining. The engine roared in protest, the trailer swaying behind me, as I fought against physics and geometry. But for every action I took, the highway had a perfect counter, keeping me ensnared in its endless spiral. Behind me those lights grew brighter still, and I began to suspect they weren't headlights at all, but eyes watching with the patience that only truly alien intelligence could muster. The truck was running smoothly, fuel gauge still frozen, clock still stopped, as if this pocket of twisted space had its own rules about the passage of time and the consumption of resources. It appeared suddenly in my headlight beams, official green reflective letters that seemed absurdly normal after the surreal confusion of the past hours. The road began to straighten, just slightly, offering the first hint of escape I'd encountered since this nightmare began. But as I approached the rest area, I could see it wasn't empty. There were other trucks parked in the long rows of diagonal spaces, dozens of them, their chrome dulled and their paint faded as if they'd been sitting there for years. Drivers sat behind windshields, dark with accumulated dust, their faces barely visible in the amber glow of the parking lot lights, hands still gripping steering wheels, eyes. The thing about long-haul trucking is that you get used to the silence, the way your cab becomes this little bubble of warmth and light cutting through the vast darkness of America's highway. You learn to appreciate the steady drone of your engine, the soft glow of your dashboard, the occasional crackle of the CB radio, breaking up the monotony. What you don't get used to, what you never should get used to, is when that silence gets interrupted by something that shouldn't be there. I've been running routes between Chicago and Denver for the better part of 15 years, driving my old Peterbilt 3709 that I've named Rosie after my late wife. She's not the prettiest truck on the road anymore, her blue paint faded and her chrome showing spots of rust, but she's reliable and she's mine. The route I usually take cuts through Iowa and Nebraska, long stretches of farmland, and small towns that roll by like scenes from a movie you've seen too many times. The warehouse was one of those nondescript concrete buildings on the outskirts of Chicago, the kind of place that doesn't advertise what goes on inside. The paperwork was simple enough: 26 pallets of industrial lighting equipment bound for a construction company in Denver. Standard freight, nothing special, just the kind of steady work that keeps the bills paid and diesel in the tank. The loading crew worked faster than usual that night, their movements efficient but somehow nervous. They kept glancing at each other with expressions I couldn't quite read, the kind of looks that pass between people who know something they're not supposed to talk about. When I asked the foreman about the cargo, he just shrugged and told me it was lighting fixtures for some big commercial project. LED panels, he said, the latest technology, high-end stuff that needed to get there in one piece. The weight felt good under Rosie's wheels, balanced and secure, and the weather forecast promised clear skies all the way to Colorado. It should have been an easy run, the kind of trip that lets you settle into that peaceful rhythm of highway driving, watching the mile markers tick by while you listen to country music and think about everything and nothing at all. I rolled through the Illinois countryside with my headlights cutting twin paths through the darkness, past sleeping farmhouses and empty grain elevators. The CB was quiet except for the occasional exchange between other drivers, and the only lights in my mirrors were the distant glow of small towns scattered across the prairie like fallen stars. I had pulled into a truck stop for fuel and a quick walk around the rig, the kind of routine check that becomes second nature after years on the road. Everything looked normal from the outside. The trailer doors were still sealed, the tires were good, and the running lights were working properly. But as I walked along the passenger side of the trailer, I thought I caught a glimpse of something strange. For just a moment it looked like there was a faint glow coming from inside the trailer, a soft blue-white light that seemed to pulse gently like a slow heartbeat. I stopped and stared at the aluminum siding, but the glow was gone, leaving me wondering if I had imagined it or if it was just the reflection of the truck stop's fluorescent lights playing tricks on my tired eye. I climbed back into the cab and continued west, but the image of that pale light stayed with me as I drove through the pre-dawn darkness. I tried to rationalize it away, telling myself that LED fixtures often have pilot lights or diagnostic displays that might glow even when they're supposedly turned off. Industrial equipment could be quirky that way, especially the high-tech stuff that companies were installing in their warehouses and office buildings these days. The trailer looked perfectly normal from behind, just a dark rectangle blocking out the stars, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was happening back there in the darkness among my cargo. Dawn came slowly over the Iowa cornfields, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that made the endless rows of harvested stalks look like a golden ocean. The morning light should have dispelled my unease, but instead it brought a new concern. When I stopped for breakfast at a family diner in a small farming town, I took another walk around the trailer, checking the seals and inspecting the cargo doors. Everything appeared secure, but as I ran my hand along the trailer's side, the metal felt warm to the touch. Not hot, just warmer than it should have been on a cool October morning. I pressed my palm against the aluminum siding and felt a subtle vibration, so faint it was almost imperceptible, like the trailer was humming a song too low for human ears to hear. The feeling followed me back into the cab as I pulled onto the highway and continued west toward Nebraska. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist, and revealing the vast flatness of the Midwest spread out before me. Other trucks appeared in my mirrors and passed by, their drivers focused on their own loads and destinations, unaware that anything unusual might be traveling the same roads they knew by heart. I tried to concentrate on driving, on the familiar routine of managing speed and following distance, watching for state troopers and monitoring the CB for reports of construction delays or weather problems ahead. But my attention kept drifting to the trailer behind me, to the cargo that was beginning to feel less like industrial lighting and more like something that didn't belong in my truck. It was early afternoon when I made my next stop, pulling into a rest area near the Nebraska border to use the facilities and grab a sandwich from my cooler. The parking area was nearly empty except for a couple of cars and one other truck parked at the far end of the lot. The other driver was doing his own inspection, walking around his rig with the careful attention that comes from years of experience. I nodded to him as I headed toward the restroom building, and he nodded back with the kind of acknowledgement that passes between drivers who share the road, but not their story. When I came back out, he was standing near his cab, looking in my direction with an expression I couldn't quite read. He walked over as I approached my truck, a middle-aged man with graying hair and the weathered face of someone who had spent decades watching America pass by through a windshield. His name was Carl, he told me, and he ran produce from California to the East Coast. He seemed friendly enough, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he had seen things on the road that weren't in any driver's manual. He told him about the lighting equipment, the LED panels bound for Denver. He nodded, but his expression didn't change, and he kept looking at my trailer with the kind of attention you give to something that doesn't quite make sense. "You might want to check your electrical connections," he said after a moment. "Looks like you might have some kind of short in your running lights. I can see them flickering from here, kind of a blue color. Could be a fire hazard if it gets worse." I turned to look at my trailer, but from where I stood, everything appeared normal. The running lights were off, as they should be in daylight, and I couldn't see any sign of the blue flickering he mentioned. When I turned back to ask him about it, Carl was already walking away, heading back to his own truck with quick, purposeful steps. He spent the next few minutes checking every electrical connection I could reach, looking for any sign of a short circuit or damaged wiring. Everything seemed fine, the connections clean and tight, the wires properly secured. But as I worked, I became increasingly aware of that subtle vibration in the trailer, stronger now than it had been that morning, accompanied by a faint humming sound that seemed to come from inside the cargo space. The afternoon sun beat down on the highway, creating heat mirages that made distant objects shimmer and dance. I found myself checking the mirrors constantly, not for traffic behind me but for any sign of that strange blue glow Carl had mentioned. In daylight the trailer looked perfectly normal, but I couldn't forget the warmth I had felt in the metal siding, or the vibration that seemed to be getting stronger with each passing hour. As evening approached and the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, I started looking for a place to stop for the night. I had been driving for nearly 18 hours, and DOT regulations required a mandatory rest period. More importantly, I was exhausted, my nerves frayed by a day of worrying about cargo that was behaving in ways that cargo shouldn't behave. The interstate stretched endlessly before me like a black ribbon, threaded through the Nevada desert, my Peterbilt's headlights cutting twin beams through the darkness that seemed to swallow everything beyond their reach. It was past 3 in the morning, that dead hour when the world belongs to night shift workers and insomniacs, and the radio had been crackling with nothing but static for the past 50 miles. The engine hummed its familiar lullaby, a deep rumbling that had become as comforting as a heartbeat after 15 years of long-haul trucking, while the air conditioning whispered softly against the oppressive desert heat that lingered even in the small hour. I'd been driving this route between Reno and Las Vegas for nearly a decade, knew every truck stop and rest area, every rise and dip in the asphalt, every billboard advertising casino buffets and quick divorce. The highway signs had become old friends, reliable markers counting down the miles to my destination, but tonight something felt different. though I couldn't quite place what it was. Maybe it was the way the stars seemed dimmer than usual, or how the distant mountains appeared to lean inward like sleeping giants. Or perhaps it was simply the weight of too many sleepless nights finally catching up with me. The CB radio crackled to life suddenly, startling me from my reverie. A trucker's voice, rough with cigarettes and coffee, cut through the static with urgent clarity that made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. Breaker 19. This is Moondog, eastbound at mile marker 217. Anyone else seeing what I'm seeing out here? That fella standing up on the overpass sign. I glanced at my odometer and realized I was still about 10 miles from that marker. But the concern in Moondog's voice sent an uncomfortable chill down my spine despite the warm desert air flowing through the cab. Another voice joined the conversation, this one younger and uncertain, crackling with the nervous energy of someone relatively new to the road. Copy that, Moondog. Road Warrior here, westbound, same location. Thought I was seeing things, but yeah, there's definitely someone up there. Looks like he's just standing on top of that big green sign, not moving at all. Pretty dangerous place to be, if you ask me. The radio fell silent for a moment, filled only with the soft hiss of static, before Moondog's voice returned with a puzzled tone that made my stomach clench with unease. Funny thing is, partner, I called it in to the highway patrol about 20 minutes ago when I first spotted him, but dispatch said they didn't have any units in the area and couldn't send anyone out for at least an hour. I pressed the transmit button on my radio, feeling compelled to join the conversation despite a growing sense of dread. This is Desert Fox approaching from the west. You boys sure about what you're seeing? Pretty dark out here to make out details on a highway sign. The response came quickly, with both drivers confirming what they'd witnessed, describing a tall figure in dark clothing, standing perfectly still atop the metal framework of the overhead sign, silhouetted against the star-filled sky like some kind of modern scarecrow watching over the empty highway. As I continued driving eastward, the mile markers ticking by with mechanical precision, I found myself leaning forward in my seat, squinting through the windshield with anticipation and mounting anxiety. The desert landscape rolled past in waves of shadow and moonlight. Sagebrush and Joshua trees standing like silent sentinels in the darkness, while my truck's diesel engine maintained its steady rhythm that usually provided such comfort, but now seemed to emphasize the isolation of this desolate stretch of highway. Mile marker 215 appeared in my headlights, then 216. And my heart began beating faster as I approached the location the other drivers had described. The highway curved slightly to the left, and as I came around the bend, I saw the familiar green rectangle of the overpass sign ahead, its white lettering reflecting my headlights as it announced the next exit 15 miles away. But there, standing motionless on the narrow metal frame at the top of the sign, was the unmistakable silhouette of a human figure. The figure appeared to be a tall man wearing what looked like a long coat or jacket, standing with perfect balance on the narrow beam that supported the sign, his arms hanging at his sides in an unnaturally still posture. He faced the oncoming traffic, which meant he was looking directly at my approaching truck, though the distance and darkness made it impossible to make out any facial features or determine if he was actually watching me. I grabbed my CB radio with trembling fingers and pressed the transmit button, my voice coming out shakier than I intended. Moondog, Road Warrior, this is Desert Fox. I'm at mile marker 217 now, and I can confirm visual on your mystery man. He's definitely up there, standing on that sign like it's the most natural thing in the world. Anyone have any idea how someone would even get up there? That sign has to be 30 feet off the ground, and I don't see any ladders or maintenance equipment around. The radio remained silent for several long moments as I drew closer to the overpass, my truck's powerful headlights illuminating the scene with stark clarity. The figure hadn't moved at all, maintaining that same rigid posture as if he were carved from stone rather than flesh and blood. There was something deeply unsettling about his perfect stillness, the way he seemed completely unbothered by the wind that I could see stirring the desert brush below, or by the massive trucks rumbling past beneath his feet at 70 miles per hour. As I passed directly under the sign, I craned my neck to look up through the windshield, trying to get a better view of the mysterious figure. For just a moment I thought I saw his head turn slightly, as if tracking my movement, but the angle was awkward and I couldn't be certain. What I could see clearly, however, was that he wore dark clothing that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it, and his build suggested a tall, thin man with an almost skeletal frame that made him appear even more ominous against the star-filled sky. The CB crackled back to life as I continued past the overpass, Moondog's voice now carrying a note of genuine fear that made my skin crawl. Desert Fox, I just passed that same spot again heading back west, and that fella is still up there. Been at least an hour since I first saw him, and he hasn't moved so much as an inch. Starting to wonder if maybe he's not quite right in the head, or maybe something worse happened to him up there. Either way, it's giving me the creeps, something fear. I adjusted my rearview mirror to keep the sign in sight as long as possible, watching the dark silhouette gradually shrink in the distance, but remain clearly visible against the lighter sky. The figure maintained his motionless vigil, and I found myself wondering what could possibly drive someone to climb up onto a highway sign in the middle of the Nevada desert at 3 in the morning. The more I thought about it, the more questions arose, each one more disturbing than the last. How had he gotten up there without equipment? Why hadn't he responded to the traffic passing below? And most unsettling of all, what was he waiting for? My radio crackled again, this time with a new voice, older and more authoritative, speaking with the measured cadence of someone accustomed to being listened to. This is Silver Dollar. Been monitoring your chatter about the man on the sign. Boys, I've been running this route for 23 years, and I've got to tell you something that might chill your bones. About 15 years ago, there was an accident at that exact same overpass. Maintenance worker named Eugene Hartwell fell from that sign during a night repair job, broke his neck on impact. They say he was working alone, against regulations, trying to fix a light that had been reported out for weeks. The older driver's words sent a cold shock through my system, and I found myself checking the mirror again, though the sign was now too far away to see clearly. Silver Dollar continued his story with the deliberate pace of someone who had carried this knowledge for years. What made it strange was that Eugene's body was found standing upright beside his truck, tools still in his hands, like he'd just finished the job. Coroner said he'd been dead for hours, but somehow he'd ended up in that position. Never did make sense to any of us who knew him. Eugene was a good man, dedicated to his work, always said the highway was safer when all the signs were properly lit and maintained. The implications of Silver Dollar's story settled over me like a heavy blanket, and I realized my hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles had gone white. I forced myself to relax, taking deep breaths while trying to rationalize what I'd seen. There had to be a logical explanation. Perhaps it was just someone playing a paw. The passenger I never let in. From Marcus Z. The rain had been my companion for the better part of 300 miles, drumming its relentless rhythm against the windshield of my Peterbilt as I pushed through the darkness, somewhere between Amarillo and Oklahoma City. It was the kind of night that made you grateful for the steady hum of the diesel engine beneath you, that familiar vibration that traveled up through the seat and into your bones, reminding you that you weren't completely alone out here in the vast emptiness of interstate. I'd been driving these routes for nearly 15 years, long enough to know every truck stop, every all-night diner, every stretch of road where the highway patrol liked to set up their speed trap, long enough to have heard every story, every urban legend, every tale that drivers like to share over coffee at 3 in the morning, when the world feels thin and strange. But I'd never experienced anything that couldn't be explained by fatigue, by the way shadows played tricks on your eyes when you'd been staring at nothing but asphalt and center lines for hours on end. The first scratch came around 2:30 in the morning, just as I was passing through a particularly desolate stretch, where the only lights came from my own headlamps cutting through the rain-soaked darkness. At first I thought it might be a tree branch that had somehow gotten lodged against the passenger side of the cab, scraping rhythmically as the wind caught it. It was a slow, deliberate sound, like fingernails dragging across metal, but softer somehow, more organic. I rolled down my window and stuck my head out into the driving rain, squinting through the darkness to see if I could spot whatever was causing the noise. The cold drops stung my face and the wind whipped through my hair, but I couldn't see anything unusual along the side of the truck. The scratch came again, longer this time, starting from somewhere near the front of the passenger door and dragging slowly toward the back. It was definitely coming from inside the door panel itself, as if something were trapped in the hollow space between the inner and outer walls of the cab. Rolling the window back up, I tried to rationalize what I was hearing. Maybe it was debris that had gotten sucked up from the road and somehow worked its way into the door frame. Perhaps a piece of metal or plastic that was now rattling around with each bump and sway of the truck. These old Peterbilts had been through countless miles and countless repairs. It wouldn't be surprising if something had come loose somewhere along the way. Instead, it seemed to follow a pattern, starting soft and tentative, then growing more insistent. 3 short scratches, then a pause. 3 longer ones, then another pause. 3 short ones again. Even through my exhaustion, I recognized it immediately as Morse code for. The realization sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the rain-cooled air seeping through the van's weather stripping. I pulled over at the next rest stop, a lonely collection of concrete picnic tables and broken streetlights surrounded by prairie grass that bent and swayed in the storm wind. The parking area was empty except for my truck, its running lights creating small pools of amber light in the overwhelming darkness. The storm had intensified, and the wind carried with it the scent of wet earth and distant lightning. I walked slowly around to the passenger side, playing the beam of my flashlight across the door and windows, looking for any sign of damage or intrusion. The paint was scratched in several places, but that was normal wear and tear for a working truck. The door handle was secure, the window intact. As I stood there in the rain examining the outside of the cab, the scratching started again from within. This time I was close enough to pinpoint exactly where it was coming from. Somewhere deep inside the door panel, in the space where the window mechanism and wiring harnesses ran. The sound was clearer now, more defined. It definitely wasn't random debris or loose parts rattling around. The scratches followed that same SOS pattern, over and over again, with a desperate urgency that made my skin crawl. I tried the passenger door handle, even though I knew I had locked it before starting my trip. The door swung open easily, the dome light casting a weak yellow glow over the worn fabric seats and scattered paperwork. Everything inside looked exactly as I had left it. My thermos in the cup holder, my logbook on the seat, a road atlas folded open to Texas and Oklahoma. But the scratching continued, now seeming to come from somewhere behind the door panel itself. Getting back into the driver's seat, I sat there listening to the rain hammer against the roof, while that persistent scratching filled the cab. SOS. 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 Always the same pattern, always coming from the same location inside the passenger door. I reached across and pressed my palm against the door panel, feeling for any vibration or movement that might explain what I was hearing. The plastic was cold under my hand, and for just a moment, I could swear I felt something pressing back against my palm from the other side. I jerked my hand away and started the engine, desperate to get moving again, to outrun whatever was happening in my own truck. But as I pulled back onto the interstate, merging into the sparse late-night traffic, the scratching only grew more intense. Now it was accompanied by what sounded almost like whispered words, too faint and distorted to make out clearly, but definitely resembling human speech. The voice, if that's what it was, seemed to be pleading, begging, trying to communicate something urgent and important. Mile after mile, the sound continued. Sometimes it would fade to almost nothing, giving me hope that whatever was causing it had finally stopped. Then it would return with renewed vigor, the scratching now accompanied by what sounded like soft tapping, as if someone were gently knocking on the inside of the door with their knuckles. The SOS pattern had evolved into longer, more complex sequences that I couldn't decode, but the desperation behind them was unmistakable. As I approached the outskirts of Oklahoma City, the first hints of dawn were beginning to touch the eastern horizon, turning the storm clouds from black to deep purple. The rain had lightened to a steady drizzle, and the worst of the wind had died down. I was exhausted, running on nothing but caffeine and adrenaline, jumping at every sound that came from the passenger side of the cab. It came during a lull between the scratching sounds, barely more than a whisper, but definitely human and definitely female. "Please," it said. The words stretched out and filled with such longing and despair that it made my chest tighten. "Please help me. I've been trying to get home for so long." I nearly swerved off the road. My hands were shaking as I gripped the steering wheel, staring at the passenger door as if I expected to see someone materialize there. "Who's there?" I called out, feeling foolish even as I said it. "What do you want?" The scratching stopped completely. For several minutes, there was nothing but the sound of my engine and the whisper of tires on wet pavement. Then, so quietly I almost missed it, came the reply. "My name is Sarah. I was trying to get to Tulsa to see my daughter, but something went wrong. I can't remember what happened, but I'm lost. I've been lost for such a long time." I pulled off at the next exit, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. This was impossible. There was no one in my truck. No way for anyone to be hiding inside the door panel, but I had heard that voice as clearly as I'd ever heard anything in my life. I parked under a streetlight at an all-night gas station and sat there trying to process what was happening to me. "Sarah," I said aloud, feeling ridiculous, but needing answers. "Sarah, if you can hear me, I need to understand. How are you in my truck? What happened to you?" The response came immediately, as if she had been waiting for me to ask. "I don't remember dying," she said, her voice seeming to come from all around me now, not just from the door panel. "I just remember being so tired and it was raining. Just like tonight. I pulled over to rest, but I never woke up, and now I'm here, trapped, trying to find my way home, but never able to leave this place between places." A terrible understanding began to dawn on me. I grabbed my phone and did a quick internet search for accidents on I-40. Deaths involving truck drivers or travelers trying to get to Tulsa. What I found made my blood run cold. 3 years ago, almost to the day, a woman named Sarah McKenna had been found dead in her car at a rest stop, about 50 miles back down.